Chapter 214. Land of Hope Choo-Choo. A train whistle resounded in every corner of the station as a metal behemoth, in the form of a steam locomotive, came to a slow stop with more than 20 carriages in tow. Dressed in a tuxedo and half-top hat, Klein was carrying an exaggerated luggage bag that appeared incongruent with his figure. He took a firm step onto the ground of the Lone Kingdom's capital, Backlund. This city was divided into two regions by the Tussock River, which flowed to the southeast. The two lands were connected by the Backlund Bridge and ferries, with a population exceeding 5 million people. It was the most prosperous capital in the southern and northern continents. Klein looked far into the distance and saw faint yellow hazes everywhere. Visibility was terrible, and the gas lamps hanging above the train platform were already lit to dispel the gloominess and darkness. "It's only 6:30. It looks like it's 9 or 10. Klein shook his head indiscernibly. Suddenly, he recalled a joke he read on the Tussock Times. A gentleman who just arrived in Backlund finds himself lost in the thick haze. Helpless, he asks a drenched gentleman passing him by, "How do you get to the Tussock River?" The gentleman answers him in a friendly manner, "Walk straight without stopping. I just swam from there." Every time I read Backlund newspapers or magazines, the reporters and editors will make a mockery of the polluted air, or the increasing number of foggy days, in every conceivable way possible. Previously, the Backlund Daily Tribune even did the statistics, and it was found that it has gone from about 60 days a year from 30 years ago to the present 75 days a year. For this, many far-sighted people established organizations like the Soot Reduction Association, Smoke Reduction Association. Apparently, there was a bill in September that motioned the need to establish the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. Klein lowered his huge luggage bag and pinched his nose to gain respite from the sudden discomfort. Then, tracing his golden chain, he fished out a golden pocket watch from his vest pocket. He popped it open and looked at the time. When he truly bade farewell to his siblings, he had especially visited a department store and spent £4.10 solely to buy a golden pocket watch, and matched it with a golden chain worth £1.05 solely. To not constantly be aware of the exact time made him feel a sense of horror. Klein had planned on buying a silver pocket watch as he felt it matched his temperament. But after considering the true essence of a clown, he finally chose a more showy and exaggerated golden watch. 6:39. It's not that much later. Klein put away his pocket watch and held his cane and luggage bag as he slowly walked out the steam locomotive station with the crowd. Suddenly, he made a sudden turn, causing a person who was secretly tailing him to have his hand fall empty when reaching for his pocket. Klein was unfazed by this episode as he followed the cement-paved road and mixed into the crowd, arriving at an intersection in front of him. There was a lawn and garden that circled around a column that resembled a chimney. No, it's very likely a chimney. Klein saw the column spewing thick smoke from its top end. A portion of the smoke floated high into the sky as a portion condensed into tiny liquid droplets that scattered everywhere. Klein paused once again and placed his luggage down. He spread open the newspaper and map that he had held onto using his other hand. While on the steam locomotive, he had already planned where he was going to go or what to do next. The experiences that he had undergone, and the mental experience that he had, when disguised as a clown in the morning, made Klein finally understand the true essence of a clown. Although being capable of knowing a little about fate, one remains helpless towards fate. Therefore, one might as well use a smiling face to hide all the pain, sorrow, confusion, and depression. At that moment, he clearly felt the clown potion digest, and believed that if he continued acting this way, it wouldn't take long for him to make another attempt at advancing. But herein lay the problem. He didn't know the corresponding name of the Sequence 7 potion, much less know its exact formula. How should I obtain the formula? The secret order seldom appears. They only seem to be interested in the Antigonus family's items. This is also why others have little understanding of them. Yes, I should consider two aspects. 1. I need to come into contact with the local Beyonder circles and see if I can find clues. 2. I should set a trap and use the Antigonus family's treasure as bait to lure the secret order out. After all, I do possess knowledge of the strange vertical pupil formed from the numerous mysterious symbols. But that's too risky. I need to be careful since the bait cannot be too good or too bad. It won't garner their interest if it's too bad. And if it's too good, I might end up attracting a shark that can swallow me whole. The Secret Order's leader, Zeratul, is a figure who guided Emperor Roselle. Maybe he had obtained the biggest slice of the pie during that revolutionary feast. Of course, he might not still be alive, as that was something from 200 years ago. Amidst his thoughts, Klein felt the coldness of Backland and couldn't help but shiver. He decided to find a residence as soon as possible. He flipped through the papers and once again browsed through the rental section and saw a circled advertisement. 15 Minsk Street, Sherwood Borough, Terrace House. Weekly rent of 18 solely. Klein had thought this through very carefully about the area in which he was to stay in. Although Backlund had a population exceeding 5 million people, he still needed to be wary about meeting the local Nighthawks. Be it the newly transferred Daly or Larada, Ayer Harson, and Borja that he previously met, they would definitely be able to recognize him. Therefore, Klein eliminated the North Borough, where the Church of the Evernight Goddesses Backlund Diocese's headquarters, and St. Samuel Cathedral, was. He also eliminated areas with the best security, and the extremely strictly monitored Empress Borough and Western Borough. These two boroughs belonged to the nobles and the richest magnates, with more of the nobles living closer to Empress Borough. After eliminating the worker areas, the harbor, and the East Borough and Backlund Bridge region where the poor gathered, Klein had few choices left. The first choice was Hillston Backlund, where the Backlund Stock Exchange, Clearing House, Futures Center, the 7 major banks' headquarters, various trust funds, rail companies and bulk cargo commerce companies were. It was known as the financial, business, and economic center of the Lone Kingdom. The second choice was Sherwood Borough, where there were many small companies and residential buildings. The two boroughs had a lot of people in them, and the security was relatively good. It was good for hiding in. After serious consideration, Klein chose the cheaper Sherwood Borough. The reason why he didn't seek out organizations like the Capital Housing Improvement Company or Capital Housing Improvement Association was due to the fact that they needed identification, which he couldn't produce at the moment. If I can't find a place to rent today, I'll find a motel that doesn't need any identification to stay for the night. Klein gathered the things in his hand and carried his luggage. According to the map, he walked towards what seemed like a department store's entrance. That was the Backlund Metro's entrance. Yes, a metro. The first time Klein saw the word metro on the newspapers and magazines, he nearly jumped in fright. He never expected that such a transportation vehicle had become a reality in this era, which hadn't entered the age of electricity. It was born 25 years ago. It first connected both banks of the Tussock River, and had now expanded to the key city boroughs. Of course, there weren't many stations. Through the main door, Klein followed the people ahead of him as he walked to the ticketing booth. After being in line for a few minutes, he finally saw a cashier with a head with beautiful golden hair. The lady didn't raise her head. All she did was point at the wooden board by the side of the window with the prices. Peak period, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. 10-minute headway, 15-minute headway for all other times. First class seat, 6 pence. Second class seat, 4 pence. Third class seat, 3 pence. Return trips are respectively 9, 6, 5 pence. Annual pass first class, £8 second class, £5 10 solely third class. No annual pass is cheaper than I imagined. There's actually no distance restriction. Melissa would definitely love this more than a horse carriage. This is the culmination of machinery, Klein thought as he suddenly felt upset. He revealed a brilliant smile and fished out 4 pence and handed it to the cashier. Second class seat. Smack. The cashier tore a ticket and stamped it before handing it to Klein. After finding the line that led to Sherwood Borough and passing through the not very strict security checks, Klein went down the flight of stairs and quickly came to the platform. He followed the labels on the ground and found the corresponding location for second-class seats. Choo-choo. He didn't wait long before he heard the chugging sound of the train and the thunderous steam whistle. He saw a huge steam locomotive, its large and meandering body, together with its black metallic luster and complex machinery, mixed together to form a unique beauty. Backlund's metro still used steam locomotives. The smoke that they spewed was specially designed to enter a pipe above and travel through a chimney out into the world. This was also the true usage for the lawn and garden out on the streets. Amidst the screeching sound of metal, Klein first waited for the passengers to alight before carrying his cane and luggage over slowly. He then allowed the conductor to check his tickets. Unlike the third-class seats, the second-class seats were one person to a seat, so there were no concerns about having one's seat snatched. Just as Klein sat down, stowed away his luggage, and leaned on his cane, he suddenly heard hurried footsteps. He subconsciously looked towards the door and saw a thin, adolescent boy rush into the carriage. The boy was wearing a coat that didn't suit his age. He wore a rounded top hat and carried a ragged haversack. He kept his head very low. "I'm sorry. I got on the wrong carriage. I'm from third class." He showed his ticket and apologized to the passengers before briskly walking towards the third-class carriage. Klein retracted his gaze and once again confirmed his destination as he waited for the doors to the carriage to close. At that moment, he heard chaotic and hurried footsteps. He then saw a few men dressed in black coats and half-top hats rush into the carriage. Are they chasing after that 15-year-old boy? Klein instinctively had such a thought. He shook his head gently and continued reading his newspapers and map, just like the other passengers on board the carriage. Chapter 215, Mrs. Sammer. Did you see a teenage boy? He's wearing an old coat. One of the men who dashed into the carriage asked the conductor fiercely. Klein glanced at the man through the corner of his eyes. He was thin and hardy, his skin a dark shade from prolonged exposure to the sun. His eyes were much more recessed than the typical Lone Kingdom citizen. A Highlander? Or a mixed blood? He nodded thoughtfully. In the middle of the northern continent, the point where the Hornacis mountain range began, there was a highland which was extremely hot and dry. Most of it belonged under the Fainapotter Kingdom, while the area west belonged to the Intis Republic. The area to the east belonged to the Lone Kingdom. Its natives were thin and barbarians, but they were brave and skillful in warfare. A long time ago, they posed as one of the biggest problems for the three nations. But with the advancement of gunpowder and the changes in the way war was carried out, these Highlanders eventually recognized reality and submitted. A large number of them left the highlands and entered Backlund, Trier, Fainapotter City, and the various flourishing cities or ports in the northern continent. Some were workers, while others became grunts of the local triads. They dared to kill, and showed no fear of thorny situations. The conductor was a man in his 20s. He shrank back when he heard that as he pointed in the direction of the third-class carriage. "I saw him. He went that way." The leader, wearing a black coat and half-top hat, nodded indiscernibly. He led his men and rushed to the third-class carriage and showed no concern towards the surrounding passengers. "If I were that boy, I would have already alighted from the third-class carriage." As Klein read his newspaper, he began letting his thoughts stray. About a minute later, the train whistled as the carriage doors closed. Chug, chug. The steam metro began speeding up as it cruised along. But at that moment, Klein suddenly sensed something as he looked up to see the door leading to the other second-class carriages. The teenage boy walked slowly into the carriage wearing his old coat and round-top hat while carrying a ragged haversack. He looked adolescent and had refined facial features. His red eyes were staid and solemn. Impressive. He alighted from the third-class carriage and circled around to enter from the first-class carriage again? Was he afraid that his pursuers had partners waiting inside the metro station? Klein was slightly surprised. He felt that the boy's handling of the situation was rather mature and careful. He was much better than most people in their 20s. He clicked this left molar lightly and secretly activated his spirit vision. He scanned the boy and saw that he was in a state of fatigue. His emotions were tense, and he was dispirited. However, he still maintained a blueness that represented calm thinking. Impressive at his age, Klein mumbled silently as he lowered his head and continued reading his papers. The boy didn't notice that he had been scrutinized by a beyonder as he headed for the third-class carriage once again. The rest of the journey happened stably and calmly. Klein arrived 20 minutes later, at one of the 3 train stations in Sherwood Borough. He took a rented carriage for nearly 10 minutes before finding Minsk Street. According to the descriptions in the papers, he came to Unit 17, which was next to Unit 15, and pulled the doorbell. Cuckoo, cuckoo, as sounds reverberated inside the house. A mechanical bird that didn't look too fancy popped out from above the door. It was about the size of a palm, and was made up of gears and other parts. It constantly nodded its head, and let out the sound of a cuckoo bird. Not a bad toy. It's just not very well crafted. Klein made an objective assessment. Nearly 20 seconds later, the dark door was pulled open. A young maidservant dressed in white and black looked warily at Klein and asked, "May I help you?" Klein smiled and waved his cane, which was now wrapped with the newspapers. "I'm here to find Mrs. Sammer about renting a house. I'm guessing it hasn't been rented out." The full name on the newspaper was Stellan Sammer. "Not at all. Please wait a moment." The maidservant bent her back politely. She rushed inside and reported to her mistress. Moments later, she came out again and ushered him in. She then helped him place his cane and luggage in the foyer, and hung his coat and hat on a clothes rack in the same place. A warm blast of air inundated him, dispersing the chill Klein had brought in. He scanned the area and first saw a uniquely designed fireplace. He saw pieces of red, smokeless charcoal burning inside. Sammer's living room was rather big. It was nearly equivalent to the entire Moretti's first floor in area. Certain areas were decorated with carpets or oil paintings of beautiful sceneries. The maidservant brought Klein to the sofa and said to her mistress in a pale yellow dress, "Madam, the guest is here." The mistress was in her 30s. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked rather pretty, and had preserved her youthfulness well. She held a silver-inlaid feathered royal fan in her hand, as she was at home, and the fireplace made for a warm environment. She didn't wear anything around her neck, revealing her white bosom and shiny long neck. "Hello there, Mrs. Sammer." Klein pressed one palm to his chest and bowed. Mrs. Sammer smiled in a reserved manner. "Good evening. Please have a seat. Do you wish for some coffee or tea?" Klein sat on the sofa and answered frankly, "Tea, please." "Julienne Marquis black tea," instructed Mrs. Sammer. She then turned her eyes to Klein and asked, "How might I address you?" "Sherlock Moriarty. You can call me Sherlock." Klein had long thought of a fake name. At that moment, he caught a whiff of a fragrance from the kitchen and saw complicated pipes. Those are my husband's designs. Although his actual job is a manager at the coin company, he's a machinery enthusiast. He's also a member of the kingdom's soot reduction association. Mrs. Sammer noticed Klein's gaze and explained with a smile, "Mrs., there's no need to go into such detail. I'm not here on a blind date with your husband," Klein lampooned as he said without his smile waning. "Mrs. Sammer, I wish to rent the Unit 15. Mrs. Sammer straightened her back as she sat elegantly. She said with a smile, "I have to remind you of certain things. Unit 15 doesn't have such pipes, reclining chairs, card tables, mahogany kitchen cabinets, fine porcelain, silver cutlery, gold-plated tea sets, or removable carpets." She pointed at the things in her house as she introduced them, one after another. After she was done, she added, "It originally belonged to my elder sister and brother-in-law, but due to a business failure, my brother-in-law had no choice but to move to the southern continent. They have a plantation at Balham. However, I don't agree with their choice. This is just too unfair for my niece and nephew. There are no good grammar schools there, not even a good home tutor." "Mrs., that's not something I would like to know." Klein nodded sincerely and said, "Apart from the weather, there's no place in the southern continent that can compare with Backlund." His agreement satisfied Mrs. Sammer greatly as her eyes darted slightly. "This house still has a 3 years lease. I wish for you to pay a year's rent at once. 18 soldi a week. The use of the furniture will cost 1 soldi. I can collect a deposit of £50. Klein shook his head and smiled. "Mrs. Sammer, you should be able to tell that I just arrived in Backlund. I don't know what will happen to me in time. To pay £50 for a deposit will lower my ability to resist any risks. My limit is half a year, £25. He still planned on renting another one-bedroom apartment in Backlund's East Borough. He would use it to change his clothes, undergo disguises, and shirk off any tailing. It was necessary for what he planned to do. Stellan nodded slightly and asked, "Have you studied at grammar school?" Klein chuckled and said, "Yes, I later self-studied history." "Do you have any identification with you?" asked Stellan casually. "I'm sorry. I was in a hurry when I left home, and forgot to bring it with me. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm from Midseashire." Klein deliberately used the accent his classmate Welch often used. When he said forgot, it reminded him of Captain Dunsmith. The smile on his face turned even more brilliant. At this moment the maidservant Julianne brought a cup of black tea over. The cup was porcelain white with classic flowery patterns. Some areas were plated in gold. Klein took a sip and found the fragrance distant. The mix of sourness and sweetness were perfect, and it was clearly much better than the Sibe black tea he often drank. Very authentic Marquis black tea. He complimented with a description which couldn't be faulted. Mrs. Stellan Sammer curled her lips and said, "Then let's do half a year's rent. £25. Klein thanked her, and engaged in a few minutes of idle chatter with her, until another maidservant found a service contract from the study. After both parties signed the contract, Klein counted £25 while feeling the pinch, and pushed it to Mrs. Sammer. Stellan counted it silently before smiling. "Mr. Moriarty, I believe you'll be finding a job in Backlund?" "Yes," Klein answered, feeling a little lost. The corners of Stellan's mouth hooked up. "I can give you some suggestions. With a weekly salary lower than £3, it would be difficult for you to live in Sherwood Borough. Your rent, food expenses, water, gas and charcoal expenses, transport expenses and everything else added up will cost at least £2.5 solely. Believe me, this is Backlund. One still has to consider new clothes and good cutlery and tea sets. A weekly salary of £3 is the bare minimum. If your weekly salary reaches £5, you can hire a maidservant. At £6, you can consider hiring a chef. At £7, you can add a male servant. For £8, you can hire an additional maidservant." "Mrs. Sammer, I think you are flaunting your wealth. I once earned more than £10 a week." Klein maintained his smile as he listened attentively. At that moment, the door suddenly opened. A stout man walked in. He was dressed in a black double-breasted suit and leather gloves of the same color. Above his lips were two elegant mustaches. "Luke, this is Mr. Moriarty. He will be our neighbor." Stellan Sammer went forward and introduced him. Obviously the master of the house, Luke took off his coat and handed it to the male servant beside him. He smiled politely and said, "Mr. Moriarty, would you like to join us for dinner? This is the manager of some coin company, a member of the Lone Kingdom's Soot Reduction Association." Klein said with a smile, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Sammer. I've eaten on the steam locomotive. Although, that taste does leave a deep impression on one." After exchanging some pleasantries, Klein was led by Julianne out of the house and into the neighboring Unit 15. The layout was very similar to the unit next door. The first floor had a huge living room, a dining room with decent lighting, 2 guest rooms, a bathroom, a cellar, a kitchen that extended all the way back. On the second floor, there were 4 bedrooms, an activity room, a solarium, a study, 2 bedrooms, and a huge balcony. Mrs. Sammer wishes to tell you that you can rent out part of it, but not to workers, or make this place too packed or noisy. "Oh, I'll bring you clean blankets, sheets, and pillowcases in a while." Julianne returned to the Sammers after informing Klein. After doing a round of packing, Klein finally settled into Backlund. He sat in an empty living room, and suddenly felt lonely. Hence, he forced himself to consider his future plans. Whether he liked it or not, revenge and advancement couldn't be done in the blink of an eye. Therefore, he had to obtain a lucrative job to prevent himself from facing any financial problems. However, the job couldn't restrict him and affect his movements and plans. In other words, he needed sufficient freedom. After some deliberation and eliminating unsuitable jobs, Klein was left with 3 choices. He could become an author by becoming a plagiarist. However, his identity was sensitive, so the more famous he became, the more trouble it meant. All he could do was give up unwillingly. The second choice was to be a news reporter. This was considered quite a decent job in this time and age. However, job applications required his educational certificates and other documents. Klein was helpless in that respect. Finally, he chose the third job, private detective. This was also the reason why he had taken on a fake name. Chapter 216. The same old gathering. Klein started his first morning in Backland under cold and humid weather conditions, with a light fog that provided very little visibility. For breakfast, he had 1 liter worth of cheap tea, costing 1 penny, and 2 pieces of toast with inferior butter in the center. He was busy the entire morning, but he first went to the Sherwood Borough's Backland Bulletin to post a tiny advertisement for a month at the cost of £30. From Tuesday, the Backland Bulletin's loyal readers would see a tiny advertisement along the seams of its 7th and 8th page. Sherlock Moriarty, good at various types of private investigations, reasonable prices, and strictly adheres to the principles of confidentiality, resides at Sherwood Borough's 15 Minsk Street. The reason why Klein didn't choose major newspapers like the Tussock Times or the Backland Daily Tribune, that had a readership all across the entirety of the Lone Kingdom, was due to the fact that his business was temporarily limited to Backland. Furthermore, he didn't wish for a sterling reputation. Therefore, the Backland Bulletin, which was well received locally and had low advertisement fees, became his first choice. After leaving the Backland Bulletin's headquarters, Klein took out a map and followed it to purchase various herb powders and silver slices from various herbal stores, flower stores, jewelry stores, and accessory stores. He did it in preparation for holding a ritual. When items that didn't have any spirituality were involved, most of the materials in mysticism could be purchased from ordinary stores. However, they weren't all under one roof, requiring him to visit many stores to collect them. To do so, Klein spent another £5. The humongous sum of £200 that he withdrew broke below the £100 mark, leaving him only with £92. Spending money is as easy as drinking water. Klein found a small cafeteria nearby and ordered a black pepper steak worth 8 pence. He returned to 15 Minsk Street at 1 in the afternoon, and without rest, he spent his time using slumber flower, dragon blood grass, dark red sandalwood, and mint powders to create holy night powder, a key ingredient needed to create a wall of spirituality. He could only make do with this method until he bought a real silver ritual dagger. Klein speculated that he would have to advance to sequence 7 before he could do away with this restriction. Few, Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and the Sun haven't requested for leave yet. The gathering will be held on time today. I wonder what surprises Mr. Hanged Man will bring me, and how many pages of Rozelle's diary he can provide. Klein laid back on his bed in the bedroom and thought about all sorts of things. To him, a private detective was a career that took into account both money and action. It allowed him to get in touch with people from all walks of life and slowly discover the Beyonder Circle in Backland. From there, he could slowly find clues regarding the secret order. Of course, if he was lucky, he would even be able to figure out the sequence 7, which corresponded to the clown through a particular circle of Beyonders, and by the corresponding potion formula and main ingredients. As for Ensanguil's whereabouts, Klein temporarily chose not to take the initiative to seek him out. He might even avoid him a little. However, if he were to accidentally discover this enemy of his, without exposing himself, he wouldn't mind doing a good deed and sending an anonymous letter to the Church of the Evernight Goddess. A private detective's income can, at most, support a middle-class standard of living. If I want enough money to buy the potion formula and Beyonder materials, it will either depend on Miss Justice, or it will be through investments with the remaining £100 that I have left in my anonymous account. Yes, I can't touch the £92 that I have for the time being. Perhaps I wouldn't be having any income for some time. With this in mind, Klein suddenly sat up. He came to the first floor and began reading the various newspapers he bought in passing. These newspapers often carried news about what had been invented and required investments, or how someone wished to form a joint venture with others to do a particular business. Klein relied on his knowledge from Earth and his understanding of this era to carefully sift through the projects. Unfortunately, None of the ones on the papers today were reliable. At 15 minutes to 3, he returned to his bedroom, locked the door, drew the curtains, and used holy night powder to create a wall of spirituality. Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the gray fog. He sat in the high-back chair belonging to the Fool before extending his spirituality and touching the crimson star that symbolized the sun, as if he was responding to a prayer. "This is one of the few things in my new life that hasn't changed," he suddenly sighed. In an area outside of the city of Silver, in a grayish-black tower that was half collapsed, 9 members of a patrol squad were gathered around a blazing bonfire, chatting about their experiences in the past few days. There were also a few other team members guarding the perimeter, prepared for any possible attacks that might break out from the darkness. Many of the City of Silver's Beyonders had used their blood to teach them a lesson. At all times, never let your guard down. The monsters in the darkness could very well be right behind you. On a night when the frequency of lightning was very low, it was necessary to keep the flames burning and the light shining. Once they were completely enveloped in darkness, it wasn't impossible for them to all disappear. No one could say for sure just what terrible things would happen in total darkness, because reality had broken the limits of their imagination time and time again. Derek Berg remained reserved and silent, as he quietly listened to his companions, reminiscing about the monster they had encountered before. It was a humanoid monster with eyes covering its entire body. In order to finish off the monster, their patrolling team suffered a heavy price with 5 injured, and 2 of them severely injured. Suddenly, Derek's vision blurred, and he felt himself being enveloped in a thick gray mist. In an inexplicably faraway place, in the depths of the gray fog, a blurry figure sat on an ancient high-back chair, looking down at him. "Prepare for the gathering." The Fool's voice echoed in Derek's ears, but none of his teammates were aware of it. After withdrawing his gaze and observing the area for more than 10 seconds, Derek moved to the very edge of the fire, leaned against the broken wall, and pretended to be asleep. Ever since he found out that the members of the 6-member council and Elder Lovia were unable to discover the existence of Mr. Fool, he gradually believed that as long as he didn't carelessly reveal any clues, he would be able to quietly attend the tarot clubs, gathering above the gray fog, even under the gaze of others. Backlund, Empressborough. Using the excuse that she was tired, Audrey returned to her bedroom. She curbed her excitement and didn't pace back and forth. Instead, she sat quietly on the bed, waiting for Mr. Fool's summoning. Father was busy communicating with the other members of Parliament about the proposed bill. And the Beyonder Guard isn't tailing me constantly. Thank you, Goddess. My life has finally returned to normal. 2 weeks have passed. Mr. Hanged Man must have prepared the pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander. I'm about to advance to sequence 8. Audrey thought with sparkling eyes. To her, this was even more exciting and worth looking forward to than the 30,000-pound bounty, and the large plantation worth at least 8,000 pounds. Finally, she saw the familiar illusory crimson surge towards her like a tidal wave, drowning her. On an ancient-looking sailboat, Alger Wilson locked the door to the captain's cabin and sat behind a sextant and the ship logs. He kept memorizing the contents of the thick stack of sheets in front of him. After the investigations, he left the bustle of Backlund without any qualms after being rewarded by the upper echelons and returned to the sea, carrying a batch of secretly copied Roselle diary pages. After digesting the seafarer potion, I'll be able to advance normally. My contributions are enough for me to trade for the formula and ingredients. However, this will expose the fact that I know the acting method. There are advantages and disadvantages. Alger shook his head, suddenly distracted. At that moment he felt the summoning of the Fool. His mind suddenly recalled the face of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalengos, whose flesh and blood quickly rotted as pieces of his face peeled off. Alger instinctively lowered his head, allowing the crimson tide to engulf him. Above the gray fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Having activated his spirit vision, Klein examined Justice, the Hanged Man, and the Sun to confirm their current states. Audrey was about to happily greet everyone when she suddenly saw the Hanged Man gesturing to her, before rushing to speak before her. "Mr. Fool, I've obtained 19 pages of Roselle's diary this time. Here, I must thank you for sending your adorer to help me get rid of Kalengos. These diary pages will be the compensation I should pay. 19 pages? Not bad. Klein didn't talk much about the adorer as he smiled faintly. That is the principle of equivalent exchange. As expected of Mr. Fool, a pirate admiral with a mystical item was nothing to him. From the looks of it, I don't have to mention my claiming of the bounty. I wonder how many high-sequence beyonders Mr. Fool has as his adorers. Audrey had begun to use the word he, him, or his to refer to the fool without realizing it. Upon hearing the fool's answer, Alger said humbly, "The limit of my current memory is 6 pages. Please allow me to give them to you over separate occasions." "No problem." Klein, who was surrounded by thick gray fog, nodded gently. The son Derek looked at the pages that appeared before the hanged man, and was very curious about the contents of the diary. With his previous experiences, he believed that the items that Mr. Fool was interested in definitely contained many mysteries. He looked at Miss Justice, and when he saw that she didn't have the impulse to ask, he cautiously maintained his silence. Soon, the 6 pages of the diary were complete and came into Klein's hands. Audrey and the others began to wait quietly. They were already used to such things. Klein looked down and read the first page. December 16th. I managed to contact the pathetic fellow who's trapped in the storm and was lost in the darkness. Finally, there's a follow-up to one of the previous pages of the diary. Klein was delighted, and he became more focused. He called himself Mr. Door and tried to teach me a complicated and difficult ritual. He wanted me to help him return to the real world, and promised to fulfill 3 of my requests. Does he think I'm stupid? I've lived for more than 60 years over my 2 lives. Does he think I can't tell that this is the usual manipulation done by evil gods and devils? But the history of the 4th epoch that he described was truly interesting. Chapter 217. Mr. Door's description. Mr. Door. This naming style is very similar to mine. I wonder what was the real name of this pathetic fellow who was lost and trapped in the deep darkness amidst the storms is, and what his sequence is. Or rather, just as Emperor Roselle had guessed, he's one of the evil gods or devils. Klein let out a silent chuckle, which was mixed with ridicule and self-deprecating humor. He was also interested in the history of the 4th epoch. I know of the most famous war of the 4 emperors in the 4th epoch, but the specific details and the main figures involved are limited to the information spread by the major churches. For example, the Dark Emperor of the Solomon Empire. It wasn't until today that this so-called Mr. Door finally answered my questions by letting me know who the remaining 3 emperors are. The half-insane Blood Emperor of the Tudor dynasty, the Night Emperor of the Trunsoist Empire, and the Emperor of the Underworld of the Southern Continent, also known as Death. According to Mr. Door's description, in this war that changed the situation of the entire world, the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor and Night Emperor fell one after another. The Emperor of the Underworld reaped the greatest benefits. Having said that, Mr. Door added with profound significance that after over a century of digestion, Death went mad. But he also became stronger. Therefore, Death teamed up with the primordial Demonis and brought about a pale disaster for the northern continent. Of course, this isn't something he witnessed personally, but rather something that he hears when he comes close to the real world every month. Death went mad, but also became stronger. Even deities can go mad? What a horrifying sentence. However, this also confirms my guess. Before the 5th epoch, those deities would often descend into the real world, directly interfering with the situation in the northern and southern continents. They might even personally appear just like Death. I asked Mr. Door if he had participated in the War of the 4 Emperors. If so, what role did he play? And what was the position the 7 deities maintained in this war? What role did they play? Mr. Door didn't answer my question. He only said in a teasing manner that the number of preeminent mighty figures in the 4th epoch far exceeds my imagination. In addition, he also mentioned 2 laws. One is the law of beyonder characteristics indestructibility, and the other is the law of similar sequence beyonder characteristics conservation, which is consistent with certain things that I have learned from that most secret and ancient organization, and also from some of the phenomena I have observed. This can lead to many interesting conclusions, making many explanations take on other forms, making one's mind tremble in horror. For example, when there are too many high-sequence beyonders in the same sequence pathway, the low-sequence beyonders would reduce and vice versa. The beyonder characteristics have been fixed at the source. It will not increase or decrease. Does this mean that there really is a God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God, and everything originated from him? This was the longest Roselle diary that Klein had ever seen. It took up 2 full pages, and one could imagine that it originally came on a double-sided page. It only became 2 separate pages after repeated copying. That's a lot of information. Klein sighed silently. As a history student who had graduated normally, he had always believed that the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsoist Empire came one after the other in a line, with a certain degree of restoration, before a new political outcome was established. To his surprise, the War of the Four Emperors described by Mr. Dorr clearly and unambiguously revealed one thing. All 3 empires had existed at the same time. If this were true, then it would really overturn most of the current research on the 4th epoch in the field of history. Klein suddenly thought of the original Klein, who was filled with interest towards archaeology and the history regarding the 4th epoch. Today I've helped him achieve his wish. I wonder if Death had already become a true deity during the War of the Four Emperors. It's hard to determine according to Mr. Dorr's descriptions. I can only first assume that the Emperor of the Underworld, who had obtained benefits from the War of the Four Emperors, had broken through his limits and become a deity, but he also went mad as a result. To have a deity go mad was truly terrifying. Just thinking about the details makes one tremble from the bottom of their heart. It's no wonder that the knowledgeable Emperor Roselle would use the word horrifying to describe this matter. Could it be that the so-called evil gods were crazy orthodox deities? Would that mean that there might only be evil gods left in this world one day? Man, does this mean that the end of days cannot be stopped? Klein smiled to hide the growing solemnity of his emotions. He felt that the future he imagined was filled with a dark gray hue. At the same time, he raised his evaluation of the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor, believing them to be the preeminent mighty figures who were close to being deities. Perhaps that means Sequence 1 is the peak existence of a single pathway. According to this logic, for Dark Emperor to live for centuries, or over a millennium wouldn't be unacceptable. That would explain the original Klein's confusion. He had obtained contradictory findings from the content recorded in the Antigonus family's notebook, with his own mentor's viewpoint. He believed that the Dark Emperor was the common name used by every emperor of the Solomon Empire. Perhaps, the Dark Emperor had always been the same Dark Emperor. Of course, other possibilities cannot be eliminated. For example, they could have been replaced 2 or 3 times. But is the name of that pathway Sequence 1 Dark Emperor? I wonder who Mr. Dorr is in the history of the 4th epoch. Emperor Roselle didn't go into detail when describing his erroneous experiments and accidental coincidences, making it impossible for me to even try to converse with that Mr. Dorr. The laws of beyonder characteristics indestructibility and similar sequence beyonder characteristics conservation shares the same description as the one used by the captain. Perhaps, the term he used came from Emperor Roselle. According to the 2 laws described by Mr. Gate, we can indeed deduce a lot of interesting speculations. For example, with there being so many holy artifacts and high-sequence beyonders in the 7 churches, there shouldn't be many low-sequence beyonders. But this contradicts reality, and the only reasonable explanation is an additional gift from the deities? For example, is the destruction of the nation of the Evernight due to the conservation of characteristics, that the mere possession of resources causes it to be in trouble? Or could it be said that their existence seriously weakens the potency of the Evernight pathway and threatens the position of the goddess? For example, theoretically speaking, certain sealed artifacts could also be used as the main ingredients for potion materials, or they can even be considered equivalent to potions. Of course, the prerequisite is to remove all latent dangers and madness. No wonder the documents that were unearthed called the 4th epoch, the epoch of the gods. So it turns out that in this epoch, there are many records of deities descending. Then what caused them to stop coming, to the point of there not being any revelations? If it wasn't for the fact that Beyonders receive responses from ritualistic magic, perhaps many of them would have doubted the existence of the deities. Many ideas came to Klein suddenly as he felt that he had delved deeper into the realm of mysticism in this Beyonder world. He flipped through the next 4 pages and was disappointed to realize that they were no longer related to Mr. Dorr. His ability as a clown allowed him to conceal his emotions well, and coupled with the gray fog's obstruction, even Audrey, who was secretly observing him, didn't notice anything amiss. He gathered his chaotic thoughts and started reading the 3rd page of the diary. September 10th. I've endured it for a long time, but I still can't help but complain a little. I must have had fucking shit for brains to chose the savant path, right? Of course, this has indeed allowed me to develop my greatest advantage, allowing the church to attach great importance to me. But the problem is that the first few sequences lack any Beyonder powers needed for combat. I can only make do by relying on mystical items, and rely way too much on external items. For example, Sequence 9 Savant only has extraordinary abilities in memory, learning, and practical skills. For example, Sequence 8 Archaeologist gains a strong physique and corresponding ancient knowledge, and they can only barely apply some ritualistic magic. For example, Sequence 7 Appraiser, whose ability is to quickly identify mystical objects, allowing them to avoid hidden dangers to the greatest extent. For example, Sequence 6 Artisan, who can produce machinery wonder, but not very powerful Beyonder objects. Apart from that, one's standard in ritualistic magic will be enhanced. It's no wonder its modern name is Machinery Specialist. Comparatively speaking, the Sequence 7 Warlock and Sequence 6 Scrolls Professor of the Mystery Prior Pathway are sufficiently tempting. It would be great if only the church has the complete sequence, and that the hidden sage doesn't exist. However, I finally received some good news. After I advance again, I'll gain Beyonder powers, combat powers that I can call my own. Sequence 5 Astromancer. Its modern name scares me a little. It's actually called Astronomer. Am I going to end up as an all-powerful mad scientist? Heavens have mercy on me. I was only a second-tier student at the college entrance examination. It had to be said that Emperor Roselle had a strange talent for making jokes. Even the recently dispirited Klein couldn't help but twitch his mouth, wishing to light a candle for this senior. Study hard and improve by the day is indeed a wise saying. He lampooned and remembered the unique trait of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. They lacked Beyonder powers when it came to combat, but they were good at making and using items. After flipping to the 3rd page of the diary, Klein continued reading. June 2nd. The kingdom has created chaos, again and again, instigating wars without being able to completely destroy the Fasak Empire, the Lone Kingdom, and the Fainapotter Kingdom. As such, the kingdom has no choice but to shoulder huge debts, and its economy is on the verge of collapse. From my observations, the people, merchants, and soldiers are very dissatisfied. The riots are just lacking a spark. This is my chance. But I have to be very careful. The Sauron family has witnessed the history of the 4th epoch, and is an ancient family with a high possibility of having high-sequence Beyonders. I need the support of the church, as well as gain a tacit agreement with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sunday. I can't appear immediately. First, I'll let the rebels destroy order before I end it all as a protector. Consul Roselle Gustave. I like that name. Chapter 218. Free General Knowledge, June 3rd. After discussing with Edwards and the others, I gave up on the idea of reaching a tacit understanding with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sunday. This might very well reveal my true intentions, making the Sauron family, and the ancient nobles, who support them, aware of them in advance, and carry out a direct approach. That would make matters extremely difficult and dangerous. It's a pity that Grimm died in the Sea of Fog. He was the smartest among us. Descend into chaos. Descend. Only with everything in chaos will I get the chance to fish in troubled waters. Only when the Sauron family is incapable of handling this situation will the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun reluctantly acknowledge me. Perhaps I should give some help to those rebels, But how should I conceal myself, so that no one would notice? June 4th, Zeradol from the Secret Order came to visit me in incognito very suddenly. And then, Klein was just feeling intrigued over the reason why Zeradol, leader of the Secret Order, would seek Roselle on the eve of the rebellion and coup d'état, when he realized that the 2 subsequent pages had nothing to do with it. This made him feel a sense of irrepressible anger. Although the 3 diary pages didn't provide very detailed descriptions, with rather straightforward accounts from Roselle, Klein could still feel the famous turmoil in Intis that happened in 1173, more than 100 years ago. The outcome was clearly recorded in history textbooks. As a colonel, Republic quashed the rebellion and enacted political changes. The Intis kingdom was transformed into a republic, with him acting as a self-appointed consul. In the following 19 years, he reformed the penal code, encouraged inventions, and protected the Industrial Revolution. He greatly increased the country's strength and fought wars both north and south, making Lemberg, Meissen, Seeger, and other countries protectorates under the Intis Republic. He also made the 3 mighty countries on the northern continent, the Fasak Empire, the Lone Kingdom, and the Fenapotter Kingdom, bow their heads. At the end of 1192, almost 20 years after his appointment as consul, Roselle converted the Republic into an empire, declaring himself Caesar. Less than 6 years later, he perished in the White Maple Palace, ending the 5th epoch's most legendary piece of history to date. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that there was more to Roselle's death than what appeared on the surface. It was just like how this famous historical event definitely had power struggles amongst Beyonders behind it, and that a Beyonder faction had leveled the situation, unlike the descriptions in textbooks. As expected, one of the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Grimm, died in the Sea of Fog. In a previous diary page, Roselle had written that there was something wrong with this horseman. It seems to have something to do with the tiny island, where they discovered many extraordinary beings. Not only was it a fortuitous encounter, but it was also a dangerous one. Klein thought of a previous entry and turned to the 5th page, feeling emotional. The contents of this page are of little value. They consist of Roselle's comments after drinking an 1128 Ormer red wine. The disillusion of finding the woman, who had gained his adoration in his youth, to be aged and out of shape, as well as a degenerate summary of a certain period when he was addicted to playing cards. The 6th page was about the same as the first one, with accounts of his daily life. However, the last one made Klein's eyes light up. April 8th. I have to send someone to investigate the Secret Order to get more information. I can't repeat my passiveness from before. I can't let Zeratul lead me by the nose anymore. So did you discover anything, Comrade Roselle? Since Klein couldn't find the rest of the information, he could only force himself to calm down and wait for the next gathering, when the hanged man would hand over another 6 pages. He knew that an investigation from over 100 years ago was unlikely to help him find any clues related to the Secret Order Association. After all, over such a long period of time, other than the special ones, many of the high-sequence Beyonders would have already died of old age, not to mention the middle or low-level members. However, Klein believed that this would help him obtain inspiration and grasp the precise identity and activity patterns that the Secret Order often used. Putting down the 6 diary pages, Klein tapped his right index finger on the edge of the long bronze table, slowly moving his gaze from Miss Justice to the hanged man, and then to the sun. Right in the diary just now, there was a line Emperor Roselle described. God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God. This is very similar to the customs of the City of Silver. Where did he hear this from? Could it be from that most ancient and secret organization, which controls the world from behind the scenes? This organization was established before the forsaken land of the gods was forsaken? Suddenly Klein had a new idea. He said with a low and gentle smile. Roselle mentioned some hidden history in his diary, and mentioned some simple general knowledge. The latter reminded me of something that I don't recall informing you all. Audrey suddenly fell into a trance. She immediately turned her body around and looked at the very top of the ancient long table in pleasant surprise. Mr. Fool is taking the initiative to mention the contents of Roselle's diary? What would it say? She was so excited and thrilled that she completely forgot that she was a spectator. Compared to her, the hanged man Alger was much more composed. However, the subconscious straightening of his back heartlessly betrayed him. Only the son, Derek, had always believed that the items of interest to Mr. Fool contained many mysteries. But he didn't know anything about Emperor Roselle, and didn't know what this name represented in the northern continent. Thus, he just found it difficult to hide his curiosity, and didn't reveal any unusual behavior. Mr. Fool, did Emperor Roselle mention some general knowledge? I'm willing to pay for this information. Audrey couldn't help but say. However, I want it to be communicated to me privately, she added silently in her heart. Klein chuckled and said, There's no need. This is very simple general knowledge. After reading this part of the diary, as the summoner of the Tarot Club, I feel it's necessary to let all of you know this. Of course, I'm very certain that some of you are already aware of this. He was mainly referring to the sun. The City of Silver had a history of 2,000 to 3,000 years, so it was impossible for them to not discover the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. Moreover, they were in a relatively extreme environment. Even if the surrounding areas had no lack of monsters in the darkness, there would still be times when they failed to obtain the corresponding materials. In order to pass on their heritage, in order for their city to continue on, using the Beyonder characteristics of the remains of their predecessors, to create a potion wasn't particularly unacceptable. To them, this was perhaps a sacred and glorious ceremony. Of course, Klein could see from a previous exchange that the hanged man knew something. It's a pity that Miss Justice cannot always be made to pay in gold pounds and transfer the money to my adorers. My adorer can't appear any less impressive. I mustn't destroy the image of the powerful man that Mr. Azek has created. Yes, I'll give it a try when I have the chance. After all, no matter how powerful a being is, they'll have subordinates that run errands. For instance, the Evernight goddess is sleepless. No one would ever suspect that the Evernight goddess isn't a true deity, just because the low-level Nighthawks are weak. Klein sighed silently. Thank you very much. Mr. Fool, you are just too generous. Audrey replied in joy. She was originally feeling 3 seconds of regret for the coarse action of using cash to purchase the information. Klein stopped rapping the table and described with a calm voice. The first piece of general knowledge, law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. The characteristics of a Beyonder is never destroyed or reduced. It's only passed from one carrier to the next. Without realizing it, I used Captain's tone. Klein's lips subconsciously curled upwards. It cannot be destroyed or reduced. It just transfers from one carrier to another. Audrey ruminated over Mr. Fool's description, feeling that there was too much meaning in that simple sentence. Her emerald green eyes turned, and when she saw that neither the hanged man nor the sun showed any signs of surprise or contemplation, she immediately understood that these two members of the Tarot Club had long known of this law. Only I didn't know, she thought, feeling somewhat aggrieved. But she quickly began to praise Mr. Fool for his kindness. At this point, Klein added, after a rampager dies, they will leave behind an item of Beyonder characteristics. It could be the main ingredient, or it could be a mystical artifact that requires sealing. An ordinary Beyonder's death results in similar results. However, the item left behind will be equivalent to the corresponding potion, without the supplementary ingredients. Of course, the item alone will contain Beyonder powers. They can be used as a half-mystical object. The plain and indifferent words instantly echoed in Audrey's mind. Layers stacked upon layers and, bit by bit, it eventually reached a crescendo. Audrey thought of cannibalism and the question, would a sequence pathway be severed if the source of Beyonder materials ceased to exist? She had asked the hanged man previously came to mind. Now she knew the answer, but she would have rather not heard it. She felt like she was having a nightmare. How can it be so cruel? Why is it so dark? Audrey had previously seen some bad situations that involved Beyonders, but those situations were only caused by a person's own perverse and evil nature. For example, Mr. A or Kalangos. They didn't affect her yearning and love for mysticism and the Beyonder world. However, this time, she discovered that the mystical world was filled with grayness and darkness. Wake up, Audrey, you can't be naive. Consider that the cruelty and darkness described by Mr. Fool are predictable. Since he had chosen this path, he had to bravely walk down it. Audrey consoled herself, easing her mood a little. She saw that the hanged man and the sun were making only habitual movements, and appeared to understand what had just been said. Humph. Mr. Hanged Man is terrible. He even wanted to use this information as an exchange previously. Ugh. This information is indeed worth a lot, and is quite important. But it's only a simple piece of general knowledge to us and Mr. Fool. Audrey suddenly wanted to laugh a little. Her mood began to improve, and she slowly pushed all the extreme examples that she had just thought of aside. Klein wasn't surprised by the three members' reaction. He continued in a calm tone. The second piece of general knowledge. Law of similar sequence beyond her characteristics conservation. Law of similar sequence beyond her characteristics conservation. The hanged man slightly changed his sitting posture. He felt that he understood something, but he was unable to fully understand what this law represented and what it consisted of. Justice and the sun shared the same feelings as he did. They were unable to directly understand the true meaning behind this law. Why similar sequence? Alger couldn't help asking. Klein smiled and replied, "What do you wish to pay for the answer?" One of the ideas he had was that general knowledge was free, but any explanation required a fee. This both matched his status and didn't waste the information. Free things cost the most. Chapter 219. Explanation. If the fool had simply mentioned that there was some simple general knowledge contained in Roselle's diary, the hanged man, Alger, wouldn't necessarily be determined to pay the price for the answer, partly because the description of it being simple killed his curiosity. Another aspect stemmed from his constant wariness against making trades with the fool, as it reminded him of the examples when deals were made with evil gods and devils. But now that he knew the so-called contents of simple general knowledge, his interest was piqued. Yet he was unable to understand parts of the description, much less gain any actual or deep grasp of the concept. Therefore, he couldn't hold back his urges to ask in absolute reverence, "Mr. Fool, what kind of payment do you want?" Yes. Justice Audrey nodded her head nearly indiscernibly, but very frequently, indicating that this was something she wanted to ask as well. Although the son Derek remained silent, and didn't make any additional body gestures, the look he gave to the fool explained everything. Klein, who was waiting for such a response, smiled and said, "Information regarding the secret order." The secret order? The hanged man Alger muttered to himself. He wasn't unfamiliar with this term. He had once received payment for explaining to Miss Justice about many secret organizations, including the secret order. Audrey and Derek both frowned subconsciously. The former's only understanding of the secret order was limited to what the hanged man had described, and the latter had never even heard of such an organization. Klein had long anticipated what the son would feel, but he wasn't surprised. According to his conjecture, the area where the City of Silver was located should have been a part of the Third Epoch, after the appearance of the first blasphemy slate, and before the appearance of the second blasphemy slate. It was even possible that it was the direct catalyst or manifestation of the cataclysm. The Zeradol family had only stepped onto the stage of history in the Fourth Epoch, and the secret order was created in the latter half of the Fourth Epoch. There was no way both entities could have existed in the same period. It would surprise Klein if the son were to know about the secret order. He would then have to overturn some of his speculations, reconstruct his knowledge of the City of Silver, the Forsaken Land of the Gods, and the Zeradol family. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Alger looked at the fool in the gray fog, deliberated his words and said, "I will accept this request and help you gather information regarding the secret order. Can you make payment in advance?" It wasn't surprising that a suspected deity was interested in an ancient and secret organization. Therefore, Alger wasn't puzzled about it. More importantly, after many gatherings, he had a guess in his mind, which was that Mr. Fool's state wasn't perfect, that he might be in a predicament, that all his attempts and the actions of his adorers on the northern and southern continents were to help him break free from his confines. This might even be related to the huge secret of why the 7 deities no longer descend upon the real world after the 4th epoch. A thought flashed through Alger's mind, and he shuddered as he felt himself entering the realm of the gods. Upon hearing the hanged man's request, Klein leaned back in his chair and nodded. No problem. If the information you have collected exceeds the value of the answer, I will provide you with further compensation. As for the circumstances in which the value of the answer was lacking, it is naturally up to the esteemed Mr. Fool to decide. If he has the ability to make the additional payment, so be it. If not, forget it. Klein silently added. Justice Audrey's eyes lit up all of a sudden. She raised her hand and said, I want to partake in this deal. Klein laughed and replied, sure. Frankly speaking, his main target was Miss Justice, because she was a local of Backlund, and she had mixed herself into several Beyonder circles. Her access to information in the Land of Hope far exceeded his, considering it was his first time in the capital. She was also more informed than the hanged man, who was out at sea most of the time. According to the earlier revelation he received from his divination, Klein believed that the clues related to the secret order would appear in Backlund, and not anywhere else. The son Derek listened quietly and after some thought said, I'm willing to use the payment I reserved and exchange it for the answer. In the previous 3-way deal, he had traded the Sequence 8 Telepathist formula for Sequence 9 Bard. Klein had promised to compensate him, and his choice at the time had been to save it up and prepare for the subsequent potion formulas and main ingredients. Klein nodded his head and gave an explanation that he had long prepared. The so-called similar sequence refers to how high sequence beyonders are exchangeable with other pathways. Let me give an example. The Death Pathway's Sequence 5, Gatekeeper, can not only be advanced normally, but one can also choose the Giant Pathway, which is the Gatekeeper Pathway's Sequence 4, Demon Hunter. This won't lead to the danger of losing control, nor will it accumulate madness. It's different from taking the wrong potion. Of course, if it's not a similar sequence, a semi-deranged state is the best result. Exchangeable? Audrey blurted out, surprised and delighted. She was surprised that sequence pathways weren't completely fixed, that they didn't need to follow the original path all the way. The price of switching wasn't being semi-deranged, and never to advance again. Within the 22 divine pathways, there were special circumstances and sequences which were similar. And what delighted her was that she had another chance to choose again in the future. It was just like being able to select something that caught her interest at Philip's department store. It was a wonderful experience. So that's how it is. Alger silently muttered to himself, suddenly feeling like he had understood several things at once, and he had resolved many of the doubts accumulated in his past experiences. This information is way too valuable. As expected of Mr. Fool, so-called simple general knowledge is enough to shock and almost low-sequence beyonders, and benefit them immensely. He sighed inwardly. Derek the son was a little disappointed, because he had no intention of changing sequences. He wanted to be the sun that lit up the darkness and dispelled the curse. However, he quickly recalled an incident that happened in the City of Silver. The former chief, a powerhouse who had the greatest possibility of breaking past the limitations of Demon Hunter, had built a mausoleum for himself and went deep inside, making it his home. Afterwards, he appeared less and less, until the main door of the mausoleum could no longer be opened. Back then, the citizens of the City of Silver all believed that a problem had arisen during the chief's advancement, and that he had gone mad, to the point of being close to losing control. He was believed to have finished himself off. Now, combined with the description from the fool, the son suddenly thought of another possibility. That chief might have been attempting to advance in sequence through a similar pathway. In one of his explorations deep into the darkness, he had acquired the corresponding formula for the death pathway, and the mausoleum might have been a special requirement. But in the end he still failed? But why didn't he turn into a monster? What did he encounter in that dark mausoleum? The City of Silver doesn't have the subsequent sequence potion formulas after Demon Hunter? As these thoughts crossed his mind, Derek was suddenly jolted back to his senses by Miss Justice's reserved voice. Mr. Fool, may I ask what other pathways are exchangeable with the spectator sequencer pathway? Sequence 4 Demon Hunter sounds pretty good. That's very suitable for me. Very suitable for Justice. Audrey admired the first high sequence name that she knew. I want to know too. Klein was tempted to answer Miss Justice's question in such a manner. Before he could say anything, Audrey added in a faltering tone. I can pay for the answer to this question. How many gold pounds do you think is enough? I believe that your adorer will need a certain amount of funds for their activities. Having said that, she recalled how Mr. Fool's adorer had easily finished Pirate Admiral Kalangos, who possessed creeping hunger. Clearly, he was a high-sequence beyonder, so she nearly said, I apologize. Mr. Fool, treat it as though I never said a thing. However, since she had already asked, she couldn't back down. Come on, Audrey. Perhaps the fool has a weaker adorer? Audrey quietly bit at her lips, silently encouraging herself. Gold pounds. Klein thought about it seriously and said, We'll make the transaction after enough information about the secret order is gathered. As he spoke, he recalled his informant in the Psychology Alchemists, Daxter Guderian. Captain and I. Sigh. Daxter's identity as an informant can no longer be verified. I wonder if it's a tragedy or a comedy. It's a pity that I can no longer contact him anymore. Otherwise, it would be the most convenient way to obtain the information regarding the spectator pathway from him. Klein smirked. All right. Audrey answered happily. The conversation between the two made the hanged man, who was about to ask a similar question, shut his mouth. He left it until he had gathered enough information on the secret order. After a brief silence, Audrey turned her head to look at Mr. Fool and raised her hand very slightly. After receiving a nod of confirmation, she turned to the member opposite her and asked with a sense of anticipation, Mr. Hanged Man, my tip allowed you to finish Rear Admiral Hurricane. Have you prepared the complete pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander? That's one of the reasons why I returned to the sea. Alger nodded gently and said, I've gotten the Beyonder material you wanted. But how should I give it to you? How should it be given to me? Audrey froze for a moment as she lost herself in thought. It's impossible to just give my address. Nor can I go through Zio and Furs. That will reveal the fact that I'm a Beyonder. It's not impossible. Emperor Roselle once said that when we should choose the lesser of two evils. At that moment Klein's heart stirred. He lightly tapped the edge of the long table and smiled. Miss Sir, are you willing to cooperate with me in making an attempt regarding this matter? Chapter 220, Klein's Sacrificial Trial Attempt. Justice was instantly thrilled as she nodded her, acting reserved and elegant. I'm very willing to cooperate. As a spectator, she clearly remembered that Mr. Fool had only used the word attempt on two things. The first time involved bringing her and the hanged man into this mysterious space, and the second time was when they were given an honorary name, so that they could attempt to make a prayer. And the outcome was sufficiently successful, revealing his true nature. What would it be this time? It really is something to look forward to. Audrey restrained her impatience and tried her best to behave as a qualified spectator. Attempt. Alger suddenly tensed up, viewing the fool's proposal with utmost wariness. What does he want to do? What is his true purpose? Is this good or bad for me? One by one, thoughts popped up in his mind. The rapidly rotting appearance of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos surfaced in Alger's mind. Finally, he lowered his head and respectfully replied, Your wish is my wish. Beside him, Derek looked at the hanged man, and then at Justice, wondering why they were so sensitive to this so-called attempt. Klein lightly tapped his fingers on the edge of the long bronze table and smiled. This attempt will make your transaction easier and safer, and it will definitely be sufficiently confidential. He turned his head to the side and looked at the hanged man. He said with a moderate pace, Do you remember the sacrificial ritual described by the sun? Klein had deliberately mentioned it to show how open he was. It made it difficult for the members of the Tarot Club to imagine that the sacrificial ceremony he was about to provide had actually first been obtained from the sun, and that he had gone through all that time and effort back, then to trick the sun out of a template sacrificial ritual. I remember. I do come into contact with such things usually, Alger answered truthfully, but his heart was throbbing. Since the Orthodox gods rarely responded to similar rituals, the word sacrifice had often been equated to evil gods and devils in the fifth epoch. Thinking about how this could lead to a terrifying outcome, the hanged man felt as if he was walking at the edge of the abyss. If he wasn't careful, he would fall in, only to be eroded and devoured. Klein followed his plans and didn't provide further explanations. He nodded slightly and said, "My idea is for you to sacrifice the Beyonder material to me through the ritual, and I'll bestow them to Miss Justice. A transaction like this will be beneficial for both of you." "That can be done?" Audrey was instantly dumbfounded. She felt that this exceeded the limits of her imagination. But she very quickly came to her senses and understood the advantages of this method and the true nature of a deity hidden behind this simple act. "Mr. Fool is great." As expected, our tarot club will be different from the other secret organizations. We'll use the method of deities to exchange for material goods and ingredients. Audrey almost said "praise the lady" in her mind out of habit, but in the end she said, "Praise Mr. Fool" instead. Alger turned even warier as he entered a state of calm thoughts. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what do I need to do?" He tried to figure out the true purpose of the fool from the process of the sacrificial ritual. Klein lightly pressed his right hand and said, "Like I said, this is only an attempt. It might not succeed, so it will need your cooperation. First of all, prepare an altar. There's no need to make it too complicated. It can be very simple and crude. The only requirement is to engrave or draw this symbol." As he spoke, a screen of light appeared in front of him. On it was the symbol of the hidden pupilless eye, and the mysterious symbol of the partial contorted lines, the same symbol on the back of the fool's chair. After previous experiments without using materials with spirituality, Klein was certain that the sacrificial ceremony he designed could create an illusory gate above the gray fog, similar to the door of summoning. However, his strength alone couldn't construct a stable channel, and he could only use the uniqueness of the mysterious space above the gray fog to complete the sacrifice. Therefore, he was 90% confident that the ceremony would be successful. The only problem was if an ordinary passageway could be constructed using ordinary materials that contained spirituality, or did it need to be Beyonder materials, as well as a sufficient number of them? "I'll let Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man bear the cost of this experiment." In any case, they knew from the very beginning that the Tarot Club was a product of an attempt. It can be foreseen that there would be other attempts subsequently, and failure is inevitable. Even deities are no exception. Klein decided to transfer the costs. As the Hanged Man, Justice, and the Sun were attempting to memorize the symbol, Klein chuckled. "If you forget, you can pray to me, and then you can remember." "All right," Audrey answered happily. "With Mr. Fool, rituals aren't tedious and troublesome." She thought happily. The Hanged Man nodded in response as Klein continued the description. "Secondly, follow the normal procedure, but there's no need to burn any more additional herbs or apply the holy oil. There's no restriction on time, just chanting my name is enough. Remember, use ancient Hermes or Jotun to recite this piece of prayer. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. After you finish chanting, combine the materials that contain spirituality with the natural power created by the incantation, and await my response. If you don't succeed in this step, change from materials containing spirituality to Beyonder materials, and try again from the beginning." After listening quietly to the procedure, Alger felt that his previous guess was very likely to be the truth. The fool was in a predicament. He offered alluring attempts, making attempts one step at a time, and planned to use himself, Justice, and the Sun to slowly break free of the restrictions. In the end, he might even descend into the real world. This was also the true reason why he had initially pulled people into this mysterious space, agreeing to the establishment of the Tarot Club. Even without this previous speculation, Alger believed that he would have come to the same conclusion after hearing of the experimental procedures required after the sacrificial ritual, and comparing it with the fool's previous attempts. The only thing that stumped him was the possession of a powerful adorer. Therefore, there was no need for him to use himself, Justice, and the Sun. His adorer could make similar attempts. There must be secrets I don't know about yet. The attempts need to be sufficiently secretive. And perhaps his adorer is being watched by certain existences? Alger began connecting the dots. After Klein finished describing the ritual, he asked in a low but gentle voice, "The sacrificial ritual needs a specific time. Mr. Hanged Man, when do you plan on making the attempt?" This was different from responding to a request, which could have a delayed response. The stable passage created by the sacrificial ritual could only exist for a very short period of time. So Klein had to wait above the gray fog ahead of time. The rainbow salamander's pituitary gland is the only beyonder material I have with me for the time being. As for materials with spirituality, I do have quite a lot. Mr. Fool, once the gathering ends, I'll immediately attempt the first scenario. If it fails, I'll seek out other beyonder materials. Once I obtain anything, I'll inform you by praying to confirm a time, Alger said as he couldn't help but turn his gaze towards Miss Justice. As a spectator, Audrey instantly understood what he meant. She answered without the slightest hesitation. "If any additional beyonder materials are required, I'll compensate you afterward." "Well, I can't guarantee the specific type of material you would want." As expected of the wealthy Miss Justice, the fool Klein couldn't help but sigh before chuckling. "We have come to an agreement." He looked at Justice and said after some thought, "Once Mr. Hanged Man's attempt succeeds, I'll inform you of the bestowment ceremony." All right. Audrey was entirely confident with Mr. Fool's abilities. After answering the question, a sudden thought struck her, as she realized that the exchange of money could also be done through this method. Of course, this was only if the attempt was a success. I wonder if items without any spirituality would work or not. I'll ask Mr. Fool again after the attempt is successful. Audrey's lips curled as she thought of the beautiful future. With the sacrifice and bestowment topic coming to an end, she deliberated for a few seconds before saying, "Mr. Fool, I've found 2 ladies suitable for our tarot club. They're both beyonders and have their own circle and resources in Backland. They're also able to keep a secret and have decent personalities. Are you willing to let them join the gathering? Does Justice want to strengthen her faction within the tarot club?" This was the most instinctual thought that Alger had. Derek was very interested in this matter as he looked sideways at Mr. Fool, waiting for his answer in anticipation. Klein appeared to be in a bit of a dilemma. Previously, he had imagined that the members of the tarot club wouldn't know each other, and they would then develop their own subordinates, forming a relatively tight and secretive organization. This way, even if a certain member was exposed, captured, or had their spirit channeled, it wouldn't have much of an impact on the tarot club. But Miss Justice's description just happened to hit his weak spot. He was hoping to find clues regarding the secret order and Lenivus by acquainting himself with beyonders with different circles and resources in Backland. If it's done through Justice, the person involved would eventually hold back. However, I'm not sure if it's possible to pull them up above the gray fog simply by reciting my name. In order to maintain his image, Klein didn't think too much and instead procrastinated on it. He said calmly, "It will require a certain amount of examination. Miss Justice, use a clandestine method that wouldn't expose yourself to let them know of my name to garner interest in them." When Audrey saw that her proposal was about to be accepted, she immediately responded in excitement, "Yes, Mr. Fool." After a few more exchanges, the gathering came to an end. The Sun, the Hanged Man, and Justice returned, while Klein remained in the gray fog, waiting for the sacrifice. Chapter 221. The Tarot Club at a higher level. The Blue Avenger was like a leaf on the surface of the undulating waves of the Sonia Sea. At times, it was raised high and sometimes low from the ebbing of the waves, but there was no sign of it being at risk of capsizing. Alger Wilson stood in the captain cabin, his back to the shelves of red and white wine, as he subconsciously paced around. Finally, he gritted his teeth and returned to the mahogany desk with a grim expression. He removed the brass sextant, found a piece of paper and a pen, and leaned over to draw the complex, mysterious symbol given to him by the fool. With a seafarer's memory, Alger quickly completed the first step of the sacrificial ritual. Then he opened the drawer and took out a candle. He set up the ritual according to the dualism principles, and placed a candle above the symbol that was formed by the combination of the pupilless eye and the partial contorted lines. One candle was placed in the middle that represented the person making the sacrifice. After cleaning up all the items on the table, Alger condensed pure water in the palm of his hand and wiped the altar clean. He then used the silver dagger from the ceremony to create a ceiling wall that surrounded his desk. After doing all this, he used his spirituality to light up the 2 candles and retreated a few steps under the dim light. Taking a deep breath, Alger lowered his head and recited in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. You are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." This ancient incantation reverberated within the wall of spirituality, stirring up spiraling gales as they swept forth with the force of nature. It was the oldest sacrificial language created by human beyonders, and it contained many mysteries itself. However, it lacked sufficient protection for the user. Bearing with the pain that was akin to having knives slicing across his skin, Alger took out a small dark brown glass bottle from his pocket, unscrewed the lid, and poured out a lot of sesame-shaped granules. These granules swirled with a metallic luster and exuded an indescribable sense of beauty. Alger scattered these granules into the wind. Whoosh! The gale grew stronger, but was no longer tempestuous. It was dyed in 2 separate colors, silver and black. As they continued to collide and mix, the 2 differently colored winds were infused into the candle flame that symbolized the fool, burgeoning and tearing open an illusory ordinary-sized door. Its surface was carved with the same symbol that Alger had drawn. At this moment, Klein witnessed the appearance of the hazy door behind his high-backed chair. He could feel the spirituality in the air that was rippling apart and stimulating the mysterious space. It seems to be working. Klein suddenly had a premonition and immediately spread out his spirituality, infusing it with upheavals and stimulation. Creak! Amidst the insubstantial sounds, the blurry door slowly opened. In the captain cabin, Alger suddenly saw the illusory door, formed out of wind and light, open. Behind it was deep darkness formed from an innumerable number of almost invisible shadows. They were lustrous splendors encompassing massive amounts of knowledge. Situated above them was the thick gray fog with the ancient palace overlooking the real world. Such a scene caused Alger to involuntarily tremble. It was a deep fear, an indescribable excitement. He hurriedly picked up the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland that he had long prepared. He held it with both hands, and with his head bowed, he raised the palm-sized object which was constantly changing in color, and had a soft feel to the ridges to the illusory door. Alger's hands grew lighter under the sudden appearance and instant disappearance of a suction force. He lost the slight tingling sensation that the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland gave him. He didn't dare raise his head until he heard the deep voice of the fool echoing in his ears. "You did well. It's my honor," Alger answered without any hesitation. He looked ahead again, only to see that the illusory door had disappeared. The gale had stopped, and the candle flames had returned to their original state. After the candles were extinguished according to the normal procedures, Alger sat down with a complicated expression and said to himself silently, "In the beginning, only people could be pulled into the world above the gray fog. After a while, responses could be made by listening to prayers. Now sacrifices and bestowment can be performed. Mr. Fool is freeing himself from his predicament one step at a time, and bit by bit, will he enter the real world?" This guess or conclusion frightened and worried Alger, but he also felt a bit of delight. "At least I'm a member of the Tarot Club, one of the earliest members," he sighed. In the majestic palace above the gray fog, Klein was playing with the pituitary gland of the rainbow salamander. Various colors were reflected on his face as they constantly changed colors. A slight tingling sensation came from his palm, and a strong sense of accomplishment filled his heart, causing him to reveal a genuine smile. In the future, the Tarot Club will become even more miraculous. After reflecting over the situation, Klein extended his spirituality and sent his will to the crimson star representing Miss Justice. After returning to her bedroom, Audrey was no longer able to sit quietly on the edge of the bed. She would restlessly flip through the books by her bed, and from time to time, scrutinize herself in the mirror with an unfocused gaze. She was looking forward to the completion of the hanged man's sacrificial ritual, but she was also afraid that the result would be a failure. Emperor Roselle had said that one must remain calm and collected when important matters arise. Audrey, come on, take a deep breath. Or perhaps I should go tease the dog. However, Susie can talk and think, so she's an entity with her own dignity. I can't just casually tease her. Audrey's mind wandered, her hand unconsciously wringing an ornate doll dressed in splendid clothing. After an unknown period of time, a thick gray fog suddenly appeared before her eyes, and in the depths of the fog, there was a lofty chair. Sitting there, the fool said with a smile, "Miss Justice, the attempt was successful. Have you prepared the materials that contain spirituality?" "That's great." As expected of Mr. Fool, Audrey forgot the hanged man's role in this matter. She held back her excitement and said, "Yes, I always have such materials with me." Audrey had been the same even before she joined the Tarot Club, but back then, she didn't know which materials could be considered to contain spirituality. She had merely moved them from the family treasury in accordance with the various essential oil formulas she had gathered. Klein nodded slightly and said, "When do you plan on holding the ritual?" "This is based on the premise that there are no Beyonders around you." "Does a Beyonder dog count?" Audrey looked at the tightly shut door, feeling a small tug at her conscience. "I can do it now," Klein tersely acknowledged. "The ritual's process is the same as I described previously. All you need to do is change the prayer to, 'Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. I pray for you to give me strength.' In addition to this, use the dualism method." Audrey thought it over, fighting the urge to nod, and she began preparing for the ritual. When the illusory door opened, and a scene even more illusory than the starry sky appeared, Audrey felt intoxicated in both body and mind. This is the mysterious world I've always been pursuing. This is the kind of feeling I've always wanted. She praised Mr. Fool wholeheartedly. It's faith towards the goddess, but for the fool it's worship. Audrey silently explained herself in her mind. Soon after, she was stunned to see that there was something on the altar. It was a soft object with lustrous color, and was filled with ridges. The rainbow salamander's pituitary gland. Audrey felt a surge of joy in her heart. Her eyes lit up as she had the urge to step forward and grab it. However, her customs of etiquette took hold of her, as she sincerely praised Mr. Fool once again. After finishing the ritual, she impatiently walked forward and carefully examined the Beyonder material 5 times. Our tarot club is at a higher level than all the other secret organizations. Audrey secretly felt smug. She then glanced warily at the door, as if afraid of Susie's sudden intrusion. She had to redouble her efforts and immediately concoct the potion to complete her advancement. A few minutes later, she held a bottle of liquid that contained constantly changing lusters that could shine to the bottom of everyone's hearts. She confidently drank the telepathous potion and successfully tied through the integration stage with the Beyonder characteristics, achieving an advancement. The view before her seemed to clear up significantly, with a great increase in other aspects. Audrey familiarly used cogitation to restrain the dissipating spirituality. After her sequence stabilized, she smiled and walked briskly to the door, letting in the golden retriever. She saw the obvious suspicion on Susie's face. "You took far longer than usual." Susie didn't hide her thoughts. Audrey sat down on an ottoman and dryly laughed before changing the subject. "Susie, tell me, how should I secretly inform Zio and Furs about a particular matter without revealing myself, yet get them interested?" Before she finished her sentence, Audrey had begun to seriously ponder over the mission Mr. Fool had assigned her. Then she looked at Susie, and Susie looked back at her. The human and dog both fell into deep thought at the same moment. After completing his goal, Klein returned to reality, slept for a little more than an hour, before hurrying out the door. He spent £1 to buy a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, wigs, and a variety of mustaches that could be torn off and stuck on with adhesives. They were disguises he would need later. Before dinner, he made a trip to East Borough, the most crowded area and the most unsafe part of the city. He rented a one-bedroom house at the rent of 4 soldi, 3 pence a week. He paid 2 weeks' rent and a deposit, coming up to a total of 17 solis. Only then did Klein complete all his early preparations. East Borough also left a deep impression on him. Most of the streets here were the same as Tingen's Lower Street, but the area that shared the traits was many times larger. The clothes of the residents here were old but decent. Many of them were dressed in shabby clothes with sallow skin and thin frames. It was as though they would turn into beasts at any moment, due to their hunger or poverty. Therefore gangs ran rampant in East Borough. When he got back to Sherwood Borough, Klein felt as if he had entered heaven from hell. For the next 2 days, he experimented with using his spirituality to perform the rituals and create charms. He no longer prayed to the goddess and waited for the effects of his tiny advertisements to bear fruit. On Thursday morning, Klein finally heard the doorbell ring. Chapter 222. The First Job. Ding dong. A rope was being tugged, causing the doorbell and the sound it made to constantly tinkle and send its sound echoing throughout the spacious but relatively empty living room. Klein, who was seated on the sofa reading a newspaper to study the various investment opportunities, stood up. He was wearing a white shirt and a black vest without a bow tie, just like what one would wear at home. The first job in my career as a detective? But I can't always be at home, waiting for a mission to arrive. Yes, I need to hang a notice on the door, along with a fountain pen, so that clients can write down the time of their next visit and allow me to prepare in advance. However, for a new detective in this profession, without any fame, doing so would basically be the same as not having a next time. Sigh. I can only go through the trouble of performing a divination in the morning to see if I would receive any jobs for the day. And if so, what time so as to make plans. Of course, it's also possible that I would miss out on missions from powerful beyonders. Well, so be it, it might be a good thing after all. He walked to the door, and without looking through the peephole, the image of the visitors outside appeared in his mind. One of them was an old lady in a black plush hat. Her back was slightly hunched, and her face was deeply wrinkled. Her skin was shriveled and sallow, but her dark dress was very formal and neat. Her temples were completely white, but her blue eyes were quite lively. She was looking at the young man beside her, gesturing for him to pull the doorbell again. The young man was in his 20s, with eyes similar to those of the old ladies. In the progressively cold weather, he wore a black double-breasted coat, a half-top hat, and a bow tie like he was about to attend a banquet. It was as if he wouldn't relax his demands of himself at any moment. With the help of a clown's premonition, Klein turned the handle, opened the door, and greeted his visitors with a smile before the bell could ring again. Good morning, madam, sir. What a wonderful day it is. At least up to this point, for I have already seen the sun for 5 minutes. He spoke of the weather in a slightly exaggerated manner, small talk that had been popular in Backlund for more than a century. Yes, it's always shy and doesn't come out from behind the fog and the dark clouds. The old lady nodded in agreement. By her side the lad asked, Are you Detective Sherlock Moriarty? Yes, and what may I help you with? I'm sorry, please come in. Let's sit down and talk. Klein turned his body to the side, making way for his guests as he pointed to the guest area. No, there's no need. I don't want to waste any time. My poor Brody is still waiting for me to save it. The old lady said with a rather sharp voice. It. Klein noticed the most important pronoun, and suddenly had a bad feeling. The very formally dressed young man nodded and said, Brody is a cat owned by my grandmother, Madame Doris. He went missing last night, and I hope you can help us find him. We live at the end of this street, and I'm willing to pay you 5 soldi for it. Of course, if you can prove that you've spent more time and effort than that, I'll make it up to you. Find a cat? The reason why you're entrusting me with this job is simply because of the convenience stemming from how we live on the same street. Klein felt that this wasn't the detective career that he had imagined. It makes me look like a clown. Well, I can't turn down my first business deal. This is a seer's point of view. He pondered for a few seconds and asked, "Can you describe it in detail?" Granny Doris spoke out before the young man could open his mouth. "Brody is a lovely, lively black cat. It's very healthy, has beautiful green eyes, and loves to eat cooked chicken breast. Goddess, last night, he ran off just like that. No, it must have gotten lost. I've placed lots of chicken breast in its bowl, but it refuses to return to take a look." Klein's lips curved up and said, "I'm very satisfied with your description, Mrs. Doris. I accept this request. All right, let's go to your home now. I need to search for clues and find traces. You should be clear that the basis of my reasoning lies in the details." Mrs. Doris didn't consult her grandson as she nodded and said, "You're the most proactive detective I've ever seen. It's a deal." Klein put on his coat and hat, picked up his cane, and followed Madame Doris and her grandson out onto the street. Unlike Tingen, roads in many parts of Backlund had been rebuilt with cement or asphalt. Even during a downpour, the roads were less muddy. While the old lady was leading the way, his grandson came close to Klein and said in a low voice, "I hope you'll do your best to find Brody. It's been one of the pillars of my grandmother's life, ever since my grandfather and parents passed away. After Brody went missing, something went wrong with my grandmother's mind, so much so that she started hearing things. She keeps telling me that she hears poor Brody mewing miserably." Klein immediately nodded and said, "I'll do my best. Right, I still haven't gotten your name." Jürgen Cooper, a senior solicitor," the young man replied. Soon they reached 58 Minsk Street and entered the dark house. "This is Brody's bowl. This is his favorite box. He always sleeps here." Doris's wrinkled face was filled with worry and expectation. Klein squatted down and found several strands of black cat fur in the box. He straightened up and gripped his silver-inlaid cane with the hand that held the cat's fur. Klein's gaze turned deep as he pretended to observe his surroundings, as he silently recited a divination sentence. His hand secretly slipped from the end of the cane, but didn't leave it completely. It just made it difficult for Jürgen or Doris to notice that the cane was standing on its own. Soon after, the black silver-inlaid cane tilted to the side. It fell very slowly, with very little movement. Klein gripped the cane again, looked in that direction, and observed it for more than 10 seconds. Then he strode over to an old cupboard. "Any signs of Brody running away?" Jürgen asked with concern. The old lady Doris was also waiting for an answer. Without answering, Klein kneeled and pulled open the door at the bottom of the cupboard. Meow! A black cat darted out, tail high, and ran for its bowl. "Brody, when did you get into the cupboard? How did you get locked in there?" Mrs. Doris cried, surprised and confused. Jürgen turned his head in surprise and looked at Klein. "How did you know it was in the cupboard?" Klein smiled and replied in a deep voice, "Inference, my good man." After obtaining the 5 solely reward from Mrs. Doris and Jürgen, as well as their friendship, Klein returned to 15 Minsk Street under the gloomy weather. Before he even got close, he saw a figure loitering in front of his door. More business. When Klein looked over, he saw that the visitor was a boy of 15 or 16, dressed in an old coat and a round hat that didn't fit his age. "It's him." Klein immediately recognized him as the boy he had met on the steam train the day he had arrived in Backlund. Back then, he was being pursued, but his maturity and calmness at the time had left quite a deep impression on Klein. What would he want to entrust me with? As he wondered, Klein walked over and smiled. "Excuse me, are you looking for me?" The teenage boy was startled as he quickly turned around, his bright red eyes filled with unconcealable fear. He composed himself and asked hesitantly, "Are you Detective Sherlock Moriarty?" "Yes." Klein looked around and said, "Let's talk inside." "All right." The teenage boy didn't refuse. Inside, Klein didn't take off his coat, but he did take off his hat and put his cane away. He led the teenage boy to the guest area, pointed at the long sofa and said, "Please have a seat. How might I address you? What job do you have for me?" "You can call me Ian." The teenage boy surveyed his surroundings and fell silent for a few seconds. "I was previously hired by another detective, Mr. Zriel Victor Lee, who helped me gather some news and information." Klein sat down, clasped his hands, and said, "Does the job have anything to do with your former employer?" Yes, Ian nodded solemnly. A few days ago I suddenly found myself being followed by someone with ill intentions. Therefore, I thought of a way to lose their tail. I believe you saw this scene yourself, Mr. Moriarty. I recognized you as the man who was sizing me up on the metro that day as soon as I saw you. This level of observational skills isn't any worse than a spectator's. Could it be that he was born with a special ability? Or is he a beyonder? Klein activated his spirit vision and looked at Ian, but he didn't find anything strange. He nodded and calmly replied, "Your response left an impression on me." Ian didn't harp on the topic and continued, "I suspect that my encounter has something to do with Mr. Zreal, so I went to visit him at his place. I found the place seemingly normal, but there were many hints that indicated that someone had infiltrated and triggered all the tiny mechanisms. I haven't seen Mr. Zreal since that day. I suspect that something has happened to him. I tried to call the police, but his disappearance period has yet to reach the required number of days to make the request. I tried to get help from other detectives that I knew, but all of them turned me down, on the grounds that they had just met Mr. Zreal at a fellow detective's party. That surprised me, because I didn't receive any response from Mr. Zreal when I contacted him, using the agreed-upon method. I still stood by my judgment, and intended to ask for the help of a detective whom Mr. Zreal doesn't know. Well, as such, that meant it would be someone I don't know either. I had no idea who to look for as well. Therefore, I could only search through the newspapers, and ended up finding you, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty. Chapter 223. 3 Matters Klein asked after listening carefully. So you suspect that the Zreal whom the detective saw was someone in disguise? Holding his brown round hat, Ian replied as if he had already thought about it. It's a possibility, but I think it's too difficult due to the huge risks involved. The party was at night, and it's true that the lights weren't very bright, but most of the people attending are detectives with keen observational skills. Just a wig, beard, or cosmetics can hardly hide from their eyes. Perhaps some beyonder powers can do it. Just like how creeping hunger enables such an ability. There was a little trap in Klein's question. He wished to determine from the teenage boy's answer, the expression on his face, and his body language to determine if he had ever come into contact with beyonders, or if he knew things about mysticism. The initial answer was no. When Ian saw Detective Moriarty nodding slightly in agreement with his reasoning, he continued, I believe that the detective saw Mr. Zreal, but he wasn't free. He was in a controlled state, in which he couldn't send out distress signals. The reason why he wasn't responding to my attempts to liaison with him is to probably signal to me that he needs help. A reasonable explanation. Klein released his clasped hands and sat back a little, making himself look more relaxed and confident. Ian fell silent for about 10 seconds before he said seriously, I'd like to entrust you with the task of investigating Mr. Zreal and determine his current condition. All I need is confirmation. Considering that Ian was a semi-professional who had gathered intelligence and information for a detective, Klein had the intention to make his acquaintance. He smiled and said, Then how much are you going to pay? You should be well aware that this may be very dangerous. Ian looked down at the pocket of his old coat and said after some deliberation, There are 2 ways. The first, I can directly give you a payment that's enough to satisfy you. Afterward, regardless of whether the mission is simple or difficult, that will be all unless you suffer a relatively serious injury. Secondly, I could pay you £5 in advance, and when you finish the job, you can add on to the bill depending on the difficulty of the matter. But it's easy to cause a dispute, even if there's a contract. Klein pretended to be in thought, and after almost 30 seconds he said in a low voice, Why don't we do it this way? You can pay me £5 in advance, and help me with 3 things after the mission is completed. Don't worry, they won't be anything difficult. They will be within your capabilities, and it won't make you feel too uncomfortable. This can be agreed upon in the contract. Ian knitted his brows before standing up. He leaned forward and stretched out his right hand. All right. From the looks of it, Ian has withheld more things than I thought. The information is so lacking that I can't even obtain a vague divination result. He pursed his lips, took a few steps forward, and bent down to pick up the coin. That night, in the wee hours of the morning, at 138 Rose Street, Backland Bridge, Klein had changed into a cheap light blue workman's outfit. His mouth, chin, and cheeks were covered with a black beard that, at first glance, made him look rough and savage. He wore a dark-colored cap and pressed it so low that it nearly covered his eyes. Such caps originated from the Intis Republic hunters. There were certain differences from the traditional deer hunting caps the Lone Kingdom hunters wore. However, such caps had become popular among the lower-class populace of Backland. Hiding in the shadows of an Intis parasol tree by the side of the road, Klein studied the house across the street with the aid of the elegant gas lamps. It was Zriel's home. The detective was from Southville. His parents, relatives, and friends were all there, and he had come to Backland alone, where he slowly forged a name for himself. He was still a bachelor, and had only hired 2 temporary maids, the kind that came by every 3 days to clean up the place, without needing to provide them with food or lodging. At the moment, the terrace house he rented was pitch dark. Klein took off the silver chain inside his sleeve, and let the topaz pendant hang down naturally. "There's danger inside. There's danger inside." After repeating it 7 times, he opened his eyes and saw the spirit pendulum spinning clockwise, but very slowly. "There's danger, but it's nothing serious," Klein muttered, and once again confirmed that he had his tarot cards, self-made charms, and holy night powder on him. After doing all this, he looked around, and taking advantage of the stillness of the night, he nimbly rushed across the street. There was no veranda, garden, or lawn as it directly faced the edge of the street. Klein went around to the side, and easily climbed up the water pipe to the small balcony on the 2nd floor, where clothes could be hung out to dry. Immediately following that, he took out a tarot card and slid it through the crack, opening the door to the corridor. Following Ian's drawing of the house's layout, Klein walked almost soundlessly to Zriel's bedroom. He lightly tapped his left molar, and activated his spirit vision. Through the wooden door he looked inside. Spirit vision could see aura colors through obstacles without spirituality. However, it was highly dependent on one's abilities. Currently, Klein was able to observe through wooden doors, but was stumped by concrete walls. Furthermore, the scenes he could see weren't too clear. In his vision, he saw 3 humanoid auras in the bedroom behind the door. The colors were blurry, and were located in different locations. There are 3 people lying in ambush. Is it to capture Ian, or someone else? The bedroom isn't that big. Klein stood in the darkness, calmly considering the results of his observations. At that moment, he suddenly retreated towards the balcony while keeping his footsteps very light. Back at the balcony, Klein took a thin silver slice from his pocket. This was a slumber charm that he had created in an attempt during the afternoon. He didn't pray to the Evernight goddess, but to himself instead. He held a ritual in the name of the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck, before entering the world above the gray fog to respond. Since this method was difficult to mobilize the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, Klein could only use his own spirituality to respond. The charms that he made in the end were worse than normal, but better than the ones he made in his own name. After surveying his surroundings again, Klein covered his mouth and whispered a word in ancient Hermes. Crimson. Feeling the chill of the charm, he moved quickly but silently to the door of Zriel's bedroom again. As he held the handle, he injected spirituality into the thin silver slice. Creak. Klein carefully twisted the handle and opened a tiny crack in the door. Immediately after that, he threw the slumber charm inside. Pulling back his arm, Klein closed the door again and began counting. 3, 2, 1. He abruptly pushed open the door and rolled on the ground. Not sensing any movement from the 3 people, Klein stood up and, using the crimson moonlight shining through the window, began observing the room. It was a normal furnished bedroom with a bed, a row of closets, a desk, a set of sofas, and a coat rack. On the other side of the bed, a man in a black coat was sleeping soundly. In addition to that, there was one person by the side of the sofa, and another in front of the closet. All of them were asleep, After confirming the trio's condition, Klein walked over to the bed and bent down to find a few short yellowish-brown hair. According to what Ian had written, Detective Zrel was a man with short, yellowish-brown hair. "This should be right," Klein whispered. He grabbed the few strands of hair and sat down on the sofa. He slowly sat in the darkness tainted by the crimson light and planned on using dream divination to find Zrel. Leaning back against the back of the sofa, the corner of his mouth curled up as he made a self-deprecating comment, "Deduction, my good man." Chapter 224. Metaphysics-styled detective. The dim room was covered in a thin veil of crimson moonlight, and everything was indistinct. The three men in the black coats were sleeping in different spots, and on the sofa, Klein's eyes half blended into the darkness by closing them. It was as if he had entered a deep slumber. His dream was a gray, distorted world, occasionally flashing with brilliance. Finally, the brilliance settled to form a scene. It was a gloomy corner, the ground sloshed with sewage. A man with short brown hair, a white shirt, and a brown vest was leaning against the wall, surrounded by a dense mischief of gray rats. Half of the man's lips had been bitten off, revealing his yellowish teeth and rotten gums. His nose was only stained with blood, mixed with some short hairs, and the flesh on his face had disappeared, piece by piece, revealing white bone. White, fat maggots were crawling around everywhere, constantly squirming, and his throat seemed to have been the victim of some wild beast. At least half of it was missing. Klein could just barely make out that this was Zrel Victor Lee. It was nearly impossible to relate him to the mature and handsome man in the black and white photograph he had taken with Ian. Zrel is already dead. In a few days, he would probably be gnawed to the point where he would only be bone. He might not even have a complete skeleton left. Klein left the dream and recalled what he had just seen. His past experiences had allowed him to witness similar corpses more calmly. Looking out of the window at the crimson moon, Klein thought for more than 10 seconds and decided to try communicating with the soul of the man in black next to the sofa. During the last few days of preparations, he had concocted a bottle of amantha extract, an eye of the spirit medication. As for Serenity Agent, Klein had no need for it. He was personally capable of invading the dreams of others and forcefully communicating with their souls while maintaining calm and rationale. After setting up a simple altar and letting the quiet and tranquil fragrance waft out to create a half-dreaming state, Klein prayed to himself, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Following that, he entered the world above the gray fog and used more than 2/3 of his spirituality to give a response. When I advance to sequence 7, such prayers should also allow me to use a little of the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, just like my summoning and bestowment rituals. Looking around, Klein made a rough judgment and quickly returned to the real world. He passed through what seemed like a starry sky and a chaotic storm of thoughts, entering the mental plane of the target. There, he saw the man's illusory figure floating in midair. "Who sent you to Zrel's home?" Klein looked at him and asked in a deep voice. The man replied in a daze, his illusory eyes vacant, "Masalt. Masalt sent me to wait for the boy named Ian." The light in his spiritual world changed, revealing a lean, capable-looking, dark-skinned man. He was none other than the leader of the group, who was chasing Ian on the steam train. As expected, it's him. Klein, who had exhausted so much of his spirituality in responding to the prayer, was beginning to feel exhausted. He hurriedly asked, "Who ordered Masalt?" "No idea. He's an executioner of our Zmanger gang. No one can order him other than the boss," the man said blankly. Zmanger, the word warrior, in the language of the Highlanders. Klein, a pseudo-historian but a true mysticism scholar, suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head, and his body involuntarily flew out of the storm of thoughts. Not long afterwards, he exited the mediumship and felt his head throbbing. He was in no hurry to leave. He methodically packed up the materials and the short yellowish-brown hair before opening the oriel window to let in the cold night wind, to disperse the smell of the amantha extract, an eye of the spirit medication. While this happened, Klein returned to the balcony, locked the door from the inside, and wiped off all the places he had touched. When Zrel's bedroom returned to its original state, He then held his hand to his chest and bowed towards the three men, who were still sleeping soundly. Straightening his back, Klein put on his gloves and leaped, nimbly flipping out of the oriel window. He stood firmly, tiptoeing in the abnormally tight space. He raised the open window's vertical latch, and used a tarot card to hold its bottom. With his clown abilities, he took in the details and adjusted the balance. After a few seconds, Klein slowly pulled back the tarot card, and the vertical latch suddenly stopped in place and didn't fall further. Whoosh! First, he closed the unlatched half of the window. Then he jumped over to the window with a latch. His right hand jerked inward, closing the other half of the window. The speed of the action was so quick that the latch didn't fall down until there was a vibration, accurately inserting itself into the matching hole. Clang! A sound that was difficult to eliminate rang out, like a strong wind slamming onto the surface of the glass. Klein knew that the three men in the bedroom were about to awaken. Without further ado, he jumped onto the street. For the current him, the height from the second floor wouldn't pose any danger. It was just that he couldn't maintain his silence when he landed, so he didn't make any obvious noises. Klein quickly left the vicinity, as well as Rose Street, but he didn't directly take a rental carriage back to Cherwood Borough's Minsk Street. He turned a few corners and headed to the neighboring East Borough. It was a cold night, and the wind sent a biting chill right into his bones. Klein shivered and decided that he would need an additional sweater for his future missions. He decided to buy charcoal on one of the following days and let the fireplace carry out its role. After an unknown period of time, he entered Backlund's East Borough despite not having a map. He had completely relied on instinct. There were only a few gas lamps to be seen in the distance, and if it wasn't for the fact that the dark clouds hadn't covered the crimson moon, Klein believed that many parts of the road would be pitch black. As he was walking, he suddenly saw pairs of eyes appear in the deep darkness in front of him. They came stooping from a distance. They sauntered over from a vague distance away, in silence. Living corpses? Klein came to a sudden halt. He reached out for his Requiem charm and tarot cards, and he quickly activated his spirit vision. He saw the unhealthy and weak-colored auras, and saw the faces of the numerous figures. These were all living people, normal living people with numbed expressions, vacant eyes, and weak movements. There were both men and women. It's almost midnight. Why are they still walking on the streets? Confused, Klein warily leaned to one side, passing the group on the sidewalk. But soon, he came across a second wave, a third wave. All of them had the same pain amidst numbness. He frowned slightly, and just as he was about to move forward to inquire, he suddenly heard a shout ahead. Get up! All of you get up! You sons of bitches! The streets and parks aren't for people like you to sleep in. Klein was startled. Then the corresponding term poor law popped up in his mind, and he understood what was going on. He had experienced the same thing himself. Phew! Klein exhaled, picked up the pace, and headed for his one-bedroom house on Black Palm Street in the East Borough. There he slept for 2 hours. After recovering some of his spirituality, he went out again and broke a withered branch to serve as a dowsing rod. The location of Zriel's corpse. The location of Zriel's corpse. After repeated divinations, Klein walked for a long time with the help of the short yellowish-brown hair, until he arrived at a corner of East Borough, where there was a sewer entrance. 12 years ago, after the Great Plague, the Lone Kingdom gradually built up an advanced sewer system in the capital, and, in one fell swoop, surpassed Roselle's heritage of the Intis Republic. Moving the manhole cover out the way, Klein held his breath and climbed down the vertical metal stairs. Since his clothes weren't specially made, he was unable to bring too many items due of the lack of pockets. He hadn't brought Quelaag's oil, which he had learned about from Fry. Klein felt especially regretful for not having brought the refreshing and odor-dispelling Quelaag's oil. 10 seconds later, Klein's feet touched the sticky ground. The feeling of filth caused fine goosebumps to pop up over his arms and body. However, he could only endure it and continue walking forward, venturing deeper into the empty and quiet sewer. There was a fork in the road ahead, one which was relatively hidden. A thick pungent smell wafted over from there. Klein turned around and walked to the end where he saw a dense number of spirituality light dots and aura colors. Without needing to use a candle, he activated his spirit vision and directly saw that in the dark corner, there was a rotten corpse that had been bitten to pieces. This was the exact same scene he had seen in the dream divination. Squeak! The densely packed gray rats scampered in every direction, but there were also some who stayed where they were, unwilling to leave and part with their food. After confirming that it was real, Klein hesitated for a moment before quickly setting up a mediumship ritual. If there's nothing wrong with Ian's description, and Zriel died only a few days ago, I should be able to get some rough information by channeling his spirit, he thought confidently. Whoosh! As the wind swirled and the wall of spirituality was set up, all the rats fled, and Klein proceeded with his ritual as he had done before. The cause of Zriel's death. The cause of Zriel's death. As he recited the words, Klein's eyes turned black. His pupils and the whites of his eyes disappeared. He quickly used cogitation to enter a dream. However, nothing appeared in that misty, illusory world. Klein opened his eyes, frowning slightly as he made his judgment. The channeling failed. Someone has dealt with Zriel's spirit. A Beyonder was involved in this. The fact that someone was able to disguise as Zriel, making the other detectives unable to see through him, also proves this point. After some deliberation, Klein came to a decision. It was to end this matter here and not get involved any further. Regardless, he had fulfilled the requirements of the job that he was entrusted with. I'll get Ian to call the police, he muttered as he put away the materials and removed the wall of spirituality. Chapter 225. Unnoticeable guidance. Klein backed up from the fork in the path, without touching Zriel's corpse. Thump! 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 Suddenly, a sound echoed in the distance through the empty sewers. Klein listened for a few seconds before decisively retreating towards the exit, down the dirty concrete road that ran along both sides of the sewage channel. There was no need to take risks in matters that didn't involve him. Klein closed the iron manhole cover after he climbed out of the sewers. After ensuring that the surrounding area looked normal, he returned to his rented room in the East Borough and changed out of his disguise. Then he put on his gold-rimmed glasses, walked to another street, took a rented carriage, and returned to Cherwood Borough in the silence and cold of 3 in the morning. However, he didn't return to Minsk Street. Then, Klein made another huge detour, and only after confirming that no one was following him did he enter his house. He slept till dawn, and was woken up by the doorbell. He sat up immediately, put on his shirt, buttoned his vest, and hurried down to the first floor to open the door. And even before that, his premonition ability as a clown was already capable of naturally forming the image of the visitor in his mind. The visitor was wearing an old coat, a brown round hat, and a tattered satchel. He had bright red eyes, a delicate face, and a quiet temperament. It was none other than Ian, the teenage boy who had come to entrust him with a job yesterday. "Good morning, Detective Moriarty." Ian greeted him and looked around. "Any progress?" "Yeah. I'm only asking because I happened to pass by." Klein nodded seriously and said, "Yes." Ian seemed shocked as he didn't say a word for quite a while. After a while he stammered in surprise. "Have you determined Mr. Zriel's condition?" "Yes." Klein paused for a moment then said seriously, "I found Zriel's corpse." "Corpse?" Ian's pupil shrank as he repeated it in a low tone. He wasn't too surprised, as if he had already expected the worst possible outcome. Klein watched silently without interjecting. "Sigh." Ian exhaled and warily surveyed his surroundings. "Your efficiency is amazing. Can you take me to see Mr. Zriel's body?" "No problem. In fact, that's what I was planning to do." Klein then thought for a moment before saying, "I hope you won't mention me when you call the police. Just say that you found the corpse yourself. I believe you know how to make up a reason." Ian wasn't surprised. He knew that not every detective liked to deal with the police. In fact, except for the very famous detectives, who often gave advice to the police with mutual cooperation, the rest were discriminated against, ostracized, and even extorted from. This was the current situation of the Lone Kingdom. "All right," Ian readily agreed. Klein withdrew his gaze in a timely manner, leaned his back against the wall, and listened. He heard the scraping sound of the manhole cover being removed, and heard someone climbing down. Carefully poking his head out, Klein discovered that Ian had re-entered the sewers. Was there a clue or something on Zreel's body? Indeed, this matter goes deeper than it seems. He nodded thoughtfully. Having satisfied his curiosity, Klein decided to leave for real and planned to seek out Casper's 2 days later. At tea time, Viscount Glaint was in his home situated in Empress Borough. The door to the study was tightly shut, separating the 4 people inside from the participating guests in the salon outside. Zio Furs, this is the reward the 2 of you deserve. Dressed in a pale yellow lace dress, Audrey pushed a bulging envelope across the desk to the 2 ladies sitting opposite her. Zio wanted to say something polite, but her hand had reached for the envelope faster than her mouth. Feeling the weight of the money, she could only say sincerely, "Miss Audrey, thank you for your generosity. Your honesty makes you look even more beautiful." As she spoke, she untied the thin string around the envelope and saw the bills inside. It was uniform gray paper money with black stripes. The stack was thick and exuded a special smell of ink, one that left one feeling refreshed. £10. Zio took one note out and checked its face value. Beside her, Furs, who appeared lazy and unbothered by money, had also leaned over. "This is at least." Observing the thickness, Zio tried to figure out how many notes there were. She couldn't help but exchange looks with Furs, and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. This was obviously a lot more than they had imagined. Audrey smiled faintly and said, "A total of £800. Decide how you will split the money between the 2 of you. I'm very sorry that this matter had placed you in danger." £800. No, there's no need to apologize. Even if we had to do it again and knew of the possible consequences, I would still accept the request. Even if it's divided evenly, with my savings, it's enough to buy the potion formula for Sheriff. Zio, who was slightly taller than 150 centimeters, stared blankly at the notes in the envelope, wishing she could pull them all out and count them over and over again. She believed that the generous and beautiful Miss Audrey wouldn't pay them any less. But what if she had made a mistake counting? Everyone makes mistakes at times. Zio raised her right hand, paused for a few seconds, then silently lowered it. The corners of Furs's lips couldn't help but rise as she said wistfully, "This is even more than the royalties I've received for my Stormwind Mountain villa so far." Should I praise Miss Audrey or laugh at the poverty of an author? She added silently. Viscount Glaint, who was sitting on the sofa, was also a little envious, but it wasn't directed at Zio or Furs. As a viscount with a fairly good financial situation, £800 wasn't a large sum. What he envied was Audrey's ability to hand out money without feeling the slightest burden. Ahem. Viscount Glaint cleared his throat. "If you can get the formula for apothecary, I will also provide you with substantial payment." "We'll do our best," Zio answered without any hesitation. Then she looked at Audrey. "We've recently come into contact with someone who's suspected to be from the psychology alchemists, and we'll soon have clues regarding the spectator potion you're looking for." "Zio, I'm already at sequence 8, far stronger than you." Audrey smiled in a reserved manner as she said, "I'm looking forward to it." With that said, the 4 began chatting about various rumors among the Beyonder circles, while following Audrey's example of finding books they wished to read. Suddenly, Zio's eyes lit up as she saw 2 hardcover books, History of the Lone Kingdom's Aristocracy, and Study of the Coat of Arms. Meanwhile, Furs also found books that interested her, Geography and People of the Fasak Empire, and Traveling the Northern Continent. "Honorable Viscount Glaint, may I borrow these 2 books? I'll return them soon." Zio looked pleadingly at the owner of the study. Glaint nodded without much care. "No problem." At his response, Furs hurriedly made a request as well, and similarly obtained his approval. The corners of Audrey's mouth curved into a faint smile as she witnessed all of this. She looked modestly to the side, pretending to be looking for a book. As a qualified spectator who had just advanced, she had accurately grasped Zio's and Furs's preferences in certain domains after being in contact with them multiple times. Thus, She had made arrangements in advance without anyone realizing it. Letting the one being guided feel like it was done out of their own will was a manifestation of the powers of a spectator. In the evening, Xiao was curled up on the sofa in front of the fireplace, reading History of the Lone Kingdom's Aristocracy under the gas lamp's illumination. Furs had gone for a gathering meant for authors. After reading for quite a while, Xiao suddenly felt something strange about the hardback cover. So she carefully examined it and found an interlayer where an ancient piece of paper was hidden inside. The front side of the paper was covered with the special symbols created by Emperor Roselle, and on the back was a paragraph written in ancient Hermes. Viscount Glaint's ancestors deciphered some of Emperor Roselle's special symbols? Xiao was suddenly excited. She struggled to decipher the ancient Hermes as she muttered silently, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Furs blinked her eyes and said, "If that's the case, I'll have to make one big round. That's too troublesome. I'm used to walking in a straight line." She paused as she asked suspiciously, "However, wasn't your reaction a bit too much?" Xiao struggled for 3 seconds, choosing between losing her dignity or losing her life, before answering honestly, "It's because I made a mistake, a fatal mistake." "What mistake?" Furs asked, rubbing her belly as she felt puzzled and concerned. Xiao hurriedly recounted the whole story of how she had discovered the interlayer in the book's cover and found an old piece of paper in it. Then, she had accidentally recited the suspected incantation in ancient Hermes silently. What she had recited seemed to contain the honorable name of some hidden existence. Where's your brain? It should be fine. The ceremony wasn't complete, and who knows if it's real or fake." Furs looked around, and for some baffling reason, she felt a chill. She followed Xiao back to the living room and saw the yellow sheet of paper, as well as Roselle's special symbols, and the sentence that was written in ancient Hermes. After a quick glance, Furs, the professional researcher in mysticism, nodded and said, "It's not any of the evil gods, devils, and secret existences that I know of. It should be fine. Furthermore, nothing has happened up till now. That means that everything should be fine." Seeing Xiao relax, she thought of the pain in her stomach, so she deliberately added maliciously, "Of course, if something were to really happen, there's no way we can rescue ourselves with our meager abilities." Xiao's face paled as she blurted out, "Furs, let's sleep together tonight." "Forget it, I'll just sleep on my own." Furs pricked up her brows and chuckled, "All right. In fact, you don't have to worry about it. Think about it. I hear strange murmurs whenever there's a full moon. But I don't see any signs me going mad or losing control. Well, we should study the other 3 books. If there's the same piece of paper and the same incantation, it means that it's very likely to be a prank from Viscount Glaint." The duo hurriedly flipped through Study of the Coat of Arms and the other books and checked them carefully, but they didn't find anything else out of the ordinary. Xiao looked at Furs, who looked back at her, turning the mood somber again. "Should we sneak into St. Samuel Cathedral's nave tonight?" Xiao came up with an inspired suggestion. That was the headquarters of the Church of the Evernight Goddess in the Backlund Diocese. "Why not St. Hireland Cathedral? I don't think the Evernight Goddess will protect me," Furs subconsciously replied. That was the headquarters of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery, which was located in the St. George Borough, adjacent to many huge factories in the southeast. The 2 ladies with different faiths fell silent again, and after a while Furs sighed and said, "And that would make us end up being targeted by the Nighthawks or the machinery hive mind. That might be the goal of that hidden existence. Alright, go to sleep. We'll know the answer tomorrow morning. If nothing happens by then, it means that it'll really be okay." In the middle of the night, the waxing crimson moon was obscured by clouds, and the stars were barely visible in the sky above Backlund. Klein instinctively woke up, lifted his blanket, got off the bed, and entered the world above the gray fog. He sat down on the high-back chair that belonged to the fool. He planned on responding to Miss Justice's companion, and proceed with the examination process. At that moment, he suddenly had a new idea. Perhaps he could try and see if he could pull her into the world above the gray fog, under the present circumstances. The young lady must have fallen asleep, and even if I succeed, she would probably treat it as a dream that appears clearer than usual. If I succeed, I can sever the connection in a timely manner to prevent her from seeing her surroundings clearly. After repeatedly deliberating over the matter, Klein stretched out his hand and tapped at the rippling ring of light to form a connection with it. Suddenly, Klein felt his spirituality surge out in an unstoppable manner, causing the mysterious space above the gray fog to tremble slightly. Just when Klein thought that his spirituality would be completely drained, everything calmed down. A blurry, distorted figure appeared at the edge of the long bronze table. In her reverie, Zio opened her eyes sleepily and saw the endless fog, the ancient high-backed chair, and a dark figure watching her. Klein was overjoyed, and immediately severed the connection according to his plan. The hazy, petite figure disappeared, but within the grayish-white mist, a crimson illusory star appeared. Klein looked at this scene and confirmed one thing. As long as someone chanted his name, he would be able to pull that person into the world above the gray fog. The crimson star was a symbol of a stable connection. However, there are certain limitations. With my current strength, at most, I can establish another connection. Based on my previous experiences, my current spirituality can only pull in beyonders who are a sequence higher than me, and it won't necessarily be a success. It's just a preliminary judgment, so it shouldn't be a problem if it's someone at the same sequence as me or lower. Klein thought, feeling satisfied. There was no need for him to respond. His attempt was already enough. Zio sat up in her sleep. She had been worrying about the potential dangers of chanting an honorary name the entire time. Not long after she fell asleep, she dreamed of a mysterious space, and a gray foggy figure looking down on her from above. The dream was so clear that Zio felt afraid. She looked at the sleeping furs beside her, and thought with a tremble, is it a nightmare caused by fear? Or is it because of the attention I garnered from some hidden existence, resulting in being haunted by evil spirits? Yes, there's going to be a gathering of Beyonders tomorrow night. In addition to buying the formula, I need to find a person who is good at exorcising evil spirits to purify myself. Chapter 227. Inventor Leopard sitting at his own dining table on a foggy morning. Klein broke up his specially bought wheat bread and soaked it in milk, improving the way he ate it. Although his body had changed a long time ago, his pursuit and obsession with delicacies were engraved into his soul. He was completely unable to adapt to the Lone Kingdom's monotonous and repetitive style of breakfast. He could only try his best at experimenting. He tried not to limit himself to toast, bread, bacon, sausages, and butter. He tried hard to expand the boundaries and improve the way he ate. For example, his recipes had new additions such as pork-filled pastries from the south, Fainapotter noodles, and roasted corn pastries. Caviar from the Fasak Empire isn't bad either, but it's too expensive. It's only suitable for formal meals. Klein scooped up a small piece of wheat bread he had softened and put it in his mouth. Just by chewing it a little, he could feel the intertwining flavors of milk with the fragrance of wheat. The aftertaste of the bread was even sweeter. After breakfast, Klein put down his cutlery, but he was in no hurry to tidy up the table. He picked up the newspapers and began to read. I'll do a divination in a while. If there's nothing else to do, I'll pay Mr. Leopard a visit at St. George Burroughs Surge Street and see if his new transportation vehicle is worth investing in. Backland is really big. Every borough is almost the size of Tingen City. The East Borough is especially ridiculous. It's at least twice as large. The easiest and most economical way to travel is to walk, followed by the steam metro, before walking again. It's just quite a waste of time. Klein's mind wandered aimlessly. Backland's public horse carriage system was rather similar to Tingen's. The price was about the same, but the only problem was that most of them were confined to a single borough. If one wanted to go from Sherwood to St. George, a few transfers were needed, and that would naturally raise the price. Such a situation made the prospects for a new transportation vehicle very alluring. Knock, knock, knock. At that moment, knocks on the door sounded. It was as loud as the pounding of a hammer. Who is it? Don't they know how to ring the doorbell? He muttered a few words, straightened his collar, walked to the door, and pulled it open. In front of him was a familiar face. It was the Highlander man, who had chased Ian at the steam metro. His skin was dark, his eye sockets recessed, and he was lean and hearty man. According to Klein's mediumship results, the man's name was Massault, an executioner of the Zmanger gang, who was almost equal to the boss. Excuse me, who are you looking for? Do you have a commission to entrust with me? Klein deliberately acted somewhat confused. Massault was wearing a black coat and a pompous silk hat, but he didn't look anything like a gentleman at all. He coldly sized Klein up. Then he asked in Lone, with a thick Highlander accent, "Are you Detective Sherlock Moriarty?" "Yes," Klein replied short and sweet. Massault nodded his head stiffly. "I want to hire you to find someone. We can talk about the exact situation inside." Klein prevented himself from acting odd in any way. Massault shook his head coldly. "There's no need." After saying that, his eyes suddenly became sharp. "The person I'm looking for is called Ian. Ian Wright. He has a pair of bright red eyes, maybe 15 or 16. He likes to wear a brown, old coat, and a round hat of the same color. I believe you know him." Klein let out a soft chuckle. "I don't know what you're talking about." Massault seemed to ignore Klein's denial. "He's a thief who has stolen an important item from me. If you can find him, you'll be paid at least £10. You've provided too few clues." Klein made up an excuse. £30. Massault made a new offer. Klein glanced at him and said, "No, this is against my principle of confidentiality." £50, Massault replied coldly. "I'm sorry, I cannot accept the mission." Klein was startled for 2 seconds, but in the end, he still chose to reject the request. Massault studied him slowly for a few seconds as his eyes slowly turned cold and fierce. He didn't offer a new price, nor did he politely bid farewell. He turned around abruptly and walked quickly to the end of the street. "This gang has pretty good intelligence. They actually know that Ian had come to me once." Klein secretly sighed, full of emotion, but he didn't feel too much anxiety or fear. "After all, I'm someone who once directly faced the son of an evil god, although it was separated by a belly." As he thought about it, his smile suddenly became brilliant. He began flipping a coin to decide whether or not he was going out today. The answer was positive. St. George Borough, Surrey Street. Having transferred from a tracked public carriage to the steam metro, before transferring to a trackless carriage, Klein finally arrived at his destination, spending a total of 11 pence. Just after he alighted the carriage, he discovered that a drizzle had already started, but he hadn't brought an umbrella. According to the newspapers and magazines, this is a daily occurrence in Backlund. The reason why hats are popular is that ladies and gentlemen don't carry umbrellas all the time. Klein pressed down on his half-top hat and briskly ran outside Unit 9 and used the eaves to shield himself from the rain. He brushed off the obvious water droplets from his body and rang the doorbell. However, he didn't hear any cuckoo sounds or tinkling sounds. "Is the doorbell broken?" Klein was just about to raise his hand to knock when he suddenly saw footsteps approaching from afar. The image of the person naturally appeared in his mind. It was a tall, thin man with black hair and blue eyes. He was in his 30s and was dressed in grayish-blue worker attire, but he appeared gentle and refined. Creak. The door opened. The gentleman rubbed his forehead and asked, "May I know who you are looking for? Is there something?" Klein took off his hat and bowed slightly. "I'm here to find Mr. Leopard. I'm interested in his new transportation vehicle." The gentleman's eyes suddenly lit up. "I'm Leopard. Come in, please." He turned to the side and allowed Klein entry. However, there was no coat rack in the foyer. Klein could only lean his cane and not take off his coat. He followed Leopard into the living room. It had to be said that the gentleman's house was very messy. On the coffee table in the living room alone were many mechanical objects, such as wrenches, bearings, and screwdrivers. "How much do you wish to invest?" All right. Would you like some coffee or black tea? It seems I'm out of black tea, Leopard blurted out. This gentleman is a bit straightforward and doesn't seem to be very good at interpersonal relationships. A thought flashed through Klein's mind, and he changed the words he planned on saying. He went straight to the point. I've to see your new transportation vehicle before I make a decision. I can't make any promises without understanding anything. As he spoke, he looked around and saw a triangular sacred emblem hanging on the wall. That was the symbol of the god of steam and machinery. The solid triangle was filled with symbols such as steam, gears, and levers. Leopard wasn't irritated by Klein's straightforwardness. He immediately said, I'll show you. As soon as he said that, he slapped his head. I almost forgot. We have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to ensure that you don't steal my invention. Mr. Leopard, you don't have a very good memory either. Klein smiled and said, that wouldn't be an issue. After signing the simple contract, Leopard led Klein into a room that seemed like an activity room. He had knocked through the neighboring guest room and basement, making it much wider and spacious. The ground was littered with components, and a rough object that was half the height of a man, that resembled a carriage, stood in the center. In addition to that, the line of the doorbell was connected there and was cleverly constructed. As long as someone pulled the rope, a steel ball would pop out from the mechanism, allowing it to roll along a special track before colliding with the object in the center to produce a clanging sound. The sound certainly wasn't too loud, but it was enough to rouse Leopard, who was engrossed in machinery. Is that the new form of transportation you invented? Klein pointed to the crude object in the middle of the room. Yes, I invented it based on Emperor Rozel's imagination. He replied with a fervent look in his eyes. Emperor Rozel's imagination? Klein asked in surprise. Leopard explained in a tone of adoration. Emperor Rozel left behind a number of manuscripts in which he drew his vision of the machines of the future. He was an outstanding genius, no, a master. Many things have already been turned into reality. Heh. This manuscript is kept in the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. There's no way for non-pious believers to borrow them. Emperor, are you still leaving no stones unturned for others? Klein's mouth twitched, almost unable to maintain his smile. Describe it in detail. He changed the subject. Leopard led Klein to the crude metallic object and opened the door. This is a transportation tool that doesn't need a horse. The driver sits in the front left seat, continuously stepping on the pedals. Through the levers, and a chain connects to the four wheels, allowing the vehicle to roll forward. And on the wheels, I used inflated rubber, which can make the journey smooth. So it's a human-powered car? Klein couldn't help but lampoon. He said with some deliberation, with such a huge carriage, and at least 4 passengers, it would be impossible to travel that far just by relying on human strength alone. That's exactly my next goal, to reduce the weight and expand the lever a few times. However, my financial situation isn't at its best. I can't fund any more attempts. Leopard looked hopefully at Klein. Why not consider other methods, such as using steam as the driving force? Klein slowly organized his words. Leopard shook his head. There have been people who have invented that, but it has a very huge body, making it difficult to drive it along many streets. That was exactly what Klein was waiting for. Then, why don't you just do something simpler? For example, have only 2 wheels with only 1 person without an outer shell. You mean something like a bicycle? Leopard asked in thought. Rozel's manuscript has that? Klein nodded heavily. Yes. Those bicycles which other people have invented aren't very practical. Simplifying this seems like it might work. It will really seem different. But who would buy it? Leopard said to himself. Klein didn't hesitate to provide him with a direction. The postman, the working class who have a bit of savings, the businessman who doesn't need to look respectable while hoping to save money. There are many of them in Backland. Leopard thought for a moment, then nodded slightly. I can try, but I don't have the money for spare parts. I'll invest 100 gold pounds. In addition to my suggestion just now, I'll take a total of, Klein hesitated to say 10% of the shares. 15% was better. After all, £100 was strictly speaking not much. You can have 35% of the shares. But that's only limited to the bicycle concept you described. Leopard spoke out first, afraid that Klein would make an unreasonable request. Deal, Klein immediately laughed. We'll first draw up a simple contract and settle this matter. Afterwards, I'll find a lawyer to make a formal contract and add some detailed terms. For example, if there's anyone else who wants to invest, they must first get my consent. No problem, Leopard replied impatiently. All he wanted was to buy his spare parts as soon as possible. In the gloominess brought about by the drizzle, Klein returned to Sherwood Burroughs Minsk Street. He entered the house and went straight to the bathroom on the first floor and resolved the problem of his bloated stomach. Splash! As the water echoed, Klein bent down to wash his hands. At that moment, an image appeared in his mind. The mirror in front of the sink reflected his lowered head, dim surroundings, and a pair of eyes to his side. A pair of eyes. Chapter 228. The mastermind. Almost instinctively, Klein bent his knees and rolled sideways toward the bathroom door. So, a small black feathered arrow stabbed into the wash basin. The arrow seemed to be made of bone and suffused a blue luster. It was extremely beautiful. If Klein had hesitated in any way, he definitely wouldn't have been able to escape this sudden attack. After rolling for a moment, Klein reached into his pocket and attempted to pull out a few tarot cards. But at that moment he felt a gust of wind engulf him. Through the corner of his eyes, he saw a black figure quickly closing in on him at high speeds. It appeared in front of him in an extraordinary pose, as he tightened his foot and kicked out from bottom to top. Realizing that he couldn't avoid the attack, Klein quickly gave up on his previous intentions and used his elbow to block the attack. With a bang, he felt his entire left arm go numb, and his body was yanked over, just like in the sport squash that the middle class loved to play the most, or like a soccer ball that was now popular among the lower class. What immense strength! Klein's heart tightened. Without being flustered, he adjusted his body in midair and changed his posture, barely maintaining his balance, as if he was performing acrobatics. Pa! 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 At this moment, a tree bark-colored blowpipe had just landed on the floor of the bathroom and bounced behind the door at a declining speed. Just as Klein was about to stretch out his body to firmly stand and face the follow-up attack, a scene suddenly flashed in his mind. The speed of the enemy in black far exceeded his expectations, arriving even faster than he had expected. He lowered his body and swung his arm, striking him in the chest. In the blink of an eye, Klein's body bent over, spinning half a circle more, like a small ball that kept falling and kept being thrown around. Pow! He stretched out his hand and pressed it to the ground, opening his legs like scissors while keeping his head low. It made black-clothed man's fist miss as it tore through empty space. The fist that was originally aimed at his chest could only hit his legs after Klein turned his body. But his legs were open wide. Pushing up, his legs closed in together, allowing Klein to leap nimbly to the side as he finally managed to stand up straight. Pow! Before he had the chance to observe his enemy, the black figure had already arrived in front of him, bringing with it a strong gust of wind. What a fast reaction! Klein quickly lifted his arms up in front of him to block. With a dull thud, he felt as if he had collided with a black bear. Failing to withstand the immense force, he could only stagger backward, his arms almost turning numb in the process. At the same time, Klein finally recognized his attacker. He had dark skin, a lean and hardy build with recessed eye sockets. He was none other than the executioner of the Zmanger gang, Massault, the person who had come to see Detective Moriarty in the morning. Pa! 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 With a fierce glint in his eyes, Massault closely pursued after him as he flung both of his arms, delivering left hooks or right punches in a barrage of attacks at Klein. The gap between Klein's strength and that of his opponent was obvious. He was unable to face him head-on, and he had to rely on his agility and premonitory senses to barely avoid the combo of punches. No, I have to make full use of my advantages. With a similar thought, Klein stopped engaging in melee combat. He lowered his body and rolled to the side, Crack. A chair was torn apart by Massault's kick. Klein supported his body with one hand as he exerted strength in his waist, and continued rolling in a bid to seek a chance to use his tarot cards and self-made charms. Tap, tap, tap. Massault caught up quickly and kicked out his legs, one after another. That was in no way slower than his opponent. He was like a giant bear with the gift of agility, and had zero weaknesses. He made it so that the rolling Klein was only capable of focusing on dodging and defending, without giving him the chance to draw his cards or use his charms. Gotcha! Bam! Bam! A chair was broken, the table overturned, the coat rack toppled, and Klein had circled most of the way around, but his situation was turning dire. I can't go on like this. He kept dodging, rolling and tumbling, seeking every opportunity to turn the situation around. Suddenly, an idea came to him when he spotted the coffee table in the living room through the corner of his eyes. Bam! Klein defended a blow with one arm, as jumped back towards the living room, while enduring the pain. At this moment, Massault's leg muscles bulged suddenly like they were inflated with air. Boom! He stepped on the ground so hard that it seemed to shake, and he jumped up and shot at Klein like a bullet, with one of his legs aimed at him. Klein barely managed to hold on for a moment before being sent flying again, crashing through the coffee table with a clang, sending the ceramic tea set flying towards the cupboard, scattering the round fountain pens, the contract template, and the various newspapers on the floor. Seeing that the detective in the black double-breasted coat was weakened from the impact and momentarily unable to stand up or roll, a fierce glint flashed in Massault's eyes. He slid forward, pushing his knee out amidst the shattering sounds of the porcelain. Klein's eyes turned dark as he watched this scene. He was already holding a contract template in his hands. He had fled to the coffee table in the living room, ignoring the warnings his premonition was giving him, solely to pick up a contract template or newspaper. When he saw Massault's knee coming at him, Klein's wrist shook. At that moment, a scene appeared in his mind once again, a scene with Massault's neck twisted backward. So, Klein slightly pressed his wrist, shaking out the contract template in his hand. So, the contract was like a dart made of fine steel, as it shot at Massault's throat. At that moment, the distance between the two of them was less than a meter. Moreover, as Massault closed in, the distance between them was decreasing. A white item was reflected in Massault's eyes, as he instinctively tried to jump back to dodge it. Oof! The contract stabbed right through Massault's throat, penetrating his windpipe. Blood with patches of bubbling blood gushed out as Massault fell in front of Klein, his knees heavily hitting the ground. Huff! 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 He pulled out the bloodied contract template and clutched his throat. However, he was unable to stop the blood from flowing out of his wound, and his eyes gradually became unfocused. In the end, his body twitched a few times, and he stopped moving. Klein took a moment to recover, before he had the strength to turn around and stand up. He had a few tarot cards between his fingers, on guard against possible counterattacks and other enemies. After activating his spirit vision, and confirming that his assailant was dead, Klein looked around and didn't see any other auras. Only then did he relax a little. He noticed that two of the chairs were broken, the coffee table was smashed up in several spots, and porcelain was strewn all over the floor. The entire living room, dining room, and foyer were in a mess. Lowering his head, he saw that the sleeves of his suit had been damaged, and that the outer layer of the cloth had been stained with a great deal of dust. Suddenly, Klein said softly in a self-deprecating manner, "There's no way to claim reimbursement for this. Ha ha, ha ha ha, ha ha ha." He laughed as if he had encountered something that could amuse him for the rest of his life. He laughed so hard that his body bent forward and backward, to the point where only his laughter reverberated in the entire house. A few seconds later, Klein stopped smiling and walked to the corpse with a heavy expression. He wanted to make the dead speak. Being familiar with the mediumship ritual and answering his own prayers, Klein took a whiff of the refreshing fragrance and used the technique of dream divination to whisper, the mastermind who sent Massault on this mission. Soon, his eyes turned black as he entered a dream and saw a gray blur. Suddenly, the gray and blurry world and lit figures changed, forming numerous scenes and images before him. In front of Masalt was a middle-aged man without a hat. His white shirt had a complicated layered petal-shaped collar and cuffs, which made him look very magnificent. Matched with a tight black vest and skinny trousers, he looked gaudy and exaggerated. This middle-aged man had brown hair and blue eyes, a thin face with a stubble. He was a very good-looking gentleman. He looked at Masalt and said in a deep voice, "No matter what you do, make sure you find Ian Wright alive. If he's dead, bring him to me within an hour, preferably within 15 minutes. Yes, Mr. Ambassador." Masalt didn't hide his unruliness, but still kept his head lowered. The scene shattered and Klein frowned. "Mr. Ambassador? This matter actually involves other countries?" Judging by the style of the shirt, the ambassador is most likely the ambassador of the Intis Republic to Backland. Ian is only a teenage boy. That gentleman is able to channel spirits, or at least he has someone around him who can do so. Klein thought for a moment, then constructed another sentence for the dream divination. The reason for finding Ian Wright. In the grayish blurry dream, Klein once again saw the middle-aged gentleman from before. He stared at Masalt and said in a low voice, "You don't need to know why. Just heed my instructions. I gave you the potion and money to become the person in power behind this Manger gang. Not for you to raise questions, but for you to do things. Yes, you only need to know that Ian Wright might be involved in an item of great importance." As the scene faded away, Klein once again exited the dream. An item of great importance? I really can't tell, Ian. What could it be? Potion. So Masalt is actually a Beyonder. It's no wonder that his combat skills were so powerful and terrifying. He should be a Beyonder adept in this field. As these thoughts crossed his mind, Klein felt exhausted. It seemed that responding to his own request had consumed too much of his spirituality. If he wanted to have his mediumship standards restored to what it was previously, he estimated that it would only happen when he was a sequence 7. After ending the ritual and dispelling the wall of spirituality, Klein looked at Masalt's corpse and carefully observed it for a long time. Finally, he saw specks of spiritual radiance converging at the wound on his opponent's throat, slowly congealing into a piece. Carefully grabbing it, Klein pulled out a dark red object that looked like jelly from Earth. Is this the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Masalt? I wonder what kind of sequence potion it is. That's easy to determine. I'll get the answer by doing a divination above the gray fog. Theoretically speaking, the Beyonder characteristic of low sequence Beyonders will be able to imbue a person with the corresponding powers, even without the supplementary ingredients. However, one can easily lose control and go insane on the spot after consuming it. Nearly all the supplementary ingredients for low sequence potions lack spirituality. Klein's thoughts ran wild before he finally forced himself to focus. A corpse was now in front of him. It gave him a headache thinking about what he should do next. Chapter 229. Lesser of two evils. Masalt's body lay there, his eyes wide open, as if he still had a murderous look in them. The wound that had severed half his throat was originally thin, but with the condensation of the Beyonder characteristic, it had expanded by quite a bit and became much more mangled. At the same time, the phenomenon of incontinence after death made his lower body reek of a stench. Klein held onto the crimson jelly-like object, feeling troubled about what he should do next. He had 3 general choices. The first was to clean up the scene, deal with his wounds, and to report it to the police in the name of legitimate self-defense. The second was to wait deep into night, throw the corpse into some sewer, and pretend that nothing had happened. The third was to immediately give up his current identity, flee to another borough, and change his name again. The problem with the first option was that Klein was still an illegal resident with skeletons in his closet. Reporting it to the police could easily lead to discovering a problem with his identity. As for the second option, other than being constantly worried that the corpse would be found and that the police would come knocking on his door, there was another hidden danger. When the ambassador behind Masalt confirms the disappearance or death of his subordinate, he would definitely send someone else to 15 Minsk Street again. When that happens, Klein would be facing perhaps a sequence 7 and/or Sequence 6 enemy. He was facing a faction that might very well be a country, a powerful country. The third option seemed to be the wisest and safest option that allowed him to avoid all the risks. But there was also a downside, and that was that the portrait of Klein was likely to be posted, making him wanted. Furthermore, it would be a portrait of his undisguised self which Mrs. Sammer next door, his neighbor lawyer Jürgen, and others would describe. Once the wanted notice was published in the corresponding newspapers, even if it was limited to the greater Backlund area, Klein would very likely be recognized by Daly and the other Nighthawks. That would make the problem become even more troublesome, as this matter involved in Singwell and sealed artifact 0-08. It was highly likely that he would be pursued by an expert at the level of a high-ranking deacon. Of course, the third option had a separate branch which was, of course, to hide the body and dump the evidence into the sewers, and then try to escape. However, there was also the risk of becoming wanted when the ambassador couldn't find Klein. He could order the members of the Zmanger gang to call the police and use the official forces of Backlund to search, and if he could track Klein down, that would be the same as the second option. After thinking about it, Klein quickly came to a decision: divination. Of course, he was inclined towards a particular option already, the lesser of two evils. The first option was relatively less risky, and it allowed him to take the initiative to a certain extent. Through exposure, he could attract the attention of the official factions and suppress the ambassador's subsequent actions from being too maniacal. He took out a piece of paper and wrote a divination statement. After that, Klein took out a spirit pendulum from his left wrist, causing the topaz pendant to naturally hang down over the surface of the paper. I should make a police report. I should make a police report. After he finished his silent incantation, he saw the spirit pendulum rotating clockwise with weak amplitudes and a relatively high frequency. This indicated a positive response. After divining the other two choices in turn, and obtaining a negative answer from both of them, Klein no longer hesitated and began to deal with the scene. He put on a pair of black gloves and began to search the corpse. He found a sharp dagger, a small stack of cash, a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, and some miscellaneous items. Klein put the rest of the items back in place, took off his gloves, held the dagger in his hand, and stabbed it into Massault's throat wound, destroying its original shape. Then he wore his gloves and let Massault grab the dagger. After doing all of this, Klein gathered together the Massault's Beyonder characteristic, the self-made charms, the tarot cards, the bloodstained contract, the paper on which the divination was written, and the various materials he carried around with him, and put them in a paper bag. Then, he summoned himself in a ritual and transformed into a special spirit. Carrying Azek's copper whistle, he felt himself become stronger and more corporeal. Klein picked up the paper bag, ended the summoning, and returned to the world above the gray fog. He placed the items from reality behind the fool's high back chair for the time being, leaving Azek's copper whistle as well. Then he relaxed himself as he stimulated the sensation of descending rapidly and re-entered his own body. The reason why Klein didn't burn the bloodstained contract and the piece of paper on which he had written the divination statement was because he was afraid that after the report was sent to the police, the matter would be transferred to a special department, and a powerful Beyonder would engage in divination pertaining to the situation. However, with the gray fog's interference, even if the eternal blazing sun were to personally descend, he wouldn't be able to obtain a productive answer. This was also the reason why Klein placed his weekly review and summary above the gray fog, after his spirituality was greatly enhanced after advancing to Sequence 8. Right now, he couldn't afford to take on more suspicion and deeper investigations. After removing the wall of spirituality, the wind that suddenly stirred blew away the remaining smell of the ritualistic materials. The items related to the domain of mysticism and Beyonders that were left behind on Klein's body, and in the entire house were the candles that were silently burning in front of him. But this time he chose ordinary candles. Since he was praying and summoning himself, there was no need to be so meticulous. And in a family, Having candles was a very normal thing that matched the era, even if he was the only bachelor in the family. After extinguishing the candles and returning them to their original spot, Klein took out his golden pocket watch, snapped it open, and estimated the number of minutes since Massault's death, and added the minimum amount of time it would take for the police to send people to investigate and report back. He wanted to ensure that even if a Beyonder came to investigate, an hour would have passed since Massault's death. In mysticism, and in the domain of spirit channeling, this was an important time point. Beyond it, the information available was very limited and vague. For example, one could discover through mediumship that the person who killed Massault was Sherlock Moriarty. However, they couldn't get the specifics of the death. As for whether or not his opponents could divine if Beyonders were involved, Klein wasn't worried at all, because the main factors involved, the bloodied template contract, were above the gray fog. Even his premonition and combat abilities would also be obscured, as the opponent's divination would definitely point towards the mysterious space above the gray fog, and would certainly suffer from interference. Fortunately, I'm also a professional. It feels like I've really become Moriarty. Klein re-examined the scene, making sure that there were no problems, and began to walk with his eyes fixed on his pocket watch. After the estimated time, he put on his gold-rimmed glasses and waited for a few minutes before he opened the door and went out. The sky in Backland had already gone dark, and the gas lamps on the street lit up the rain. As a middle-class neighborhood, Minsk Street was often patrolled by the police. Klein waited for a while, then spotted the target and went up to meet them. They were two low-ranking constables with only one chevron on their palette. They held guns, batons, and were holding up an umbrella while looking around. "Officers, a criminal attacked me," Klein shouted with great skill. His unkempt appearance made the two constables place importance on the matter. They each took out their batons and looked warily to the side. "Where's the criminal?" the round-faced, brown-eyed cop asked in a deep voice. Klein pointed to his house. "He sneaked into my home and tried to kill me. In the fight, I accidentally stabbed him to death." Stabbed him to death. The two constables exchanged looks and looked at Klein with scrutiny. "Take us there." "All right." Klein acted like he had just survived a disaster as he led the two officers to 15 Minsk Street, took out his key, and opened the door. The two police constables first saw the chaotic scene before noticing the corpse laying on the ground. They noticed the hideous wound on the deceased's throat and noticed a bloody dagger. "Watch the scene. I'll return to the station and report it to the inspector," another constable said to his round-faced, brown-eyed colleague. "All right." The round-faced, brown-eyed constable cast his gaze on at Klein, his face and body language revealing his wariness and caution. After a while, a sergeant dressed in black and white checkered uniform with 3 chevrons on his epaulette arrived with the constable from before and 2 other subordinates. The constables investigated the scene, and while searching for clues, the sergeant with a short brownish-yellow beard under his chin brought Klein to the side and began asking some preliminary questions. "Name: Sherlock Moriarty. This is my rental receipt for half a year." Klein had long prepared all of this. The sergeant gave him a casual look and continued asking, "What's your occupation?" "Private detective," answered Klein frankly. The sergeant frowned and said, "Do you know the deceased? Do you know why he attacked you?" "I know him. His name is Massault, and he's the executioner of the Swordsmanship gang." Klein didn't wait for the sergeant to ask any further questions as he continued. "I had previously accepted a job from Ian Wright, who asked me to investigate his former employer, Detective Zriel Victor Lee. This matter happened to be related to the Swordsmanship gang and Massault. I tailed him and found out that he was secretly meeting a gentleman who appeared to be of significant standing. Massault addressed him as Mr. Ambassador." After saying that, Klein was unsurprised to see the sergeant's expression change. "Ambassador? Do you know his name?" the sergeant asked in a deep voice. "I don't know, but if I saw his picture, I'd definitely recognize him," Klein told the truth. "This morning, Massault came to me and asked me to seek Ian Wright. On the basis of my professional ethics as a private detective, I refused him, and when I got home in the evening, I was attacked and almost killed by him. Thankfully, am still quite skilled at combat, and was sufficiently quick to react. The sergeant thought for a moment, and asked for details of the fight. Klein recounted the fight from beginning to end nearly in its entirety, changing his premonition to a reaction, then changing the contract template he had thrown in the fight into a dagger that Massault had dropped. Yeah. Follow us back to the police station and wait for the autopsy results, the results of the on-site investigation, and inquiries from the relevant parties involved. The sergeant's thoughts wasn't on the case anymore, clearly acting rather perfunctory. Right now he only had one thought in his mind. This was an important case involving foreign ambassadors. He had to report it immediately. In his daze, he suddenly thought of a question and quickly added, "What's your faith?" "God of steam and machinery," Klein replied without hesitation. The Backlund headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms was in the Cherwood borough, so cases involving Beyonders were often referred to them. With one exception, the people involved had to be believers of the Lord of Storms. In order to not encounter the Nighthawks, Klein had no choice but to let the goddess down. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.